high atop Sinai, where thunder once cracked and fire once blazed, silence now reigned thick, sacred, alive. Moses climbed not toward spectacle, but toward something deeper, a revelation hidden from the crowds, entrusted not to tablets of stone alone, but to time itself. Angels waited in stillness, ready to unveil a secret history, a divine record of creation, covenant, and destiny measured not in years, but in jubilees. What if Genesis was only the surface? What if behind the familiar stories lay a heavenly calendar, unseen and exacting? The story of the Book of Jubilees is the journey into that silencia forgotten book, a whispered reckoning, a cosmic clock ticking beneath the scriptures we thought we knew. And then came the light not of sun or fire, but of memory and promise. It stood before him, not as a man, but as majesty veiled in form, the angel of the presence. His voice was not heard but felt, as if the bones remembered him from before they were knit in the womb. He bore no weapon, yet truth radiated from his being like a sword unsheathed. His eyes held the beginning of days, and yet they looked upon Moses with something gentler than time purpose. "Moses," the angel said without sound, "scribe of what was, keeper of what must be." And Moses, who had seen wonders and plagues, who had heard the voice in the bush and stood before kings, trembled not in fear, but in recognition. Here stood not a messenger, but the memory of God's will, clothed in eternal fire. The angel of the presence did not offer commands, he offered remembrance. He opened the scroll of the beginning, not ink on parchment, but living breath unfolding before Moses' eyes. Jubilees and weeks were spoken, time divided not by sunrises, but by the breath of heaven itself. He showed the garden unspoiled, the first breath, the fall, the sorrow, the hope. Each word etched itself into Moses' soul like stars carved into night. The angel did not merely speak history, he unveiled it. Moses saw the hands that shaped Adam. He wept with Enoch. He felt the rising waters of judgment and the warmth of covenant after the rain. Each generation unfolded with both glory and frailty, and still the angel's voice pressed on, unwavering. This was not a story of minute, was the telling of divine rhythm, of heaven's heartbeat through human clay. And the angel said, "Write, not for kings, not for the proud, but for the children of the covenant, who will forget unless they remember." Moses bowed his head, not from burden, but from awe, for he had not merely ascended Sinai to receive the law. He had ascended to witness the first light again, through the eyes of the one who stood beside the Creator when time began. In the hush between thunder and silence, the writing began. In the stillness before breath, before sound dared to ripple through the void, there was only the presence of the Eternal One. Not time, not dust, not shadow, only the voice, speaking where no ear yet listened. And with that voice came the first day. Light was summoned, not made, but revealed, and it parted, hidden from the scene. Darkness shrank from the command, and the first evening and morning bowed in silent obedience. On the second day, the heavens were stretched, vast and thin like breath held between two hands. The firmament rose, dividing the deep from the deep, and the waters sighed in their new places, still remembering the closeness they once knew. The angel of the presence recounted this not with grandeur, but with reverence, as though each word he spoke recalled a note from an ancient hymn sung only once. Then came the third day, when the dry land rose like a promise from beneath the seas. Earth took form, not harsh but gentle, ready to cradle the roots of trees not yet born. And from the soil burst green thingsherbs, fruit, every seed already dreaming of forests. Creation was not chaotic, it moved with rhythm, as though a great hand painted reality with calm precision. On the fourth day, the lights were set not just to shine, but to mark time, to hold memory. The sun to govern the day, the moon to keep the night company, and stars scattered like whispers across the firmament. They were not merely celestial bodies, they were signs, fixed into place to guide feasts and seasons and years yet to be counted. The fifth day filled the waters and skies. Birds sang before man could hear them, and the deep churned with life great and small, silent and thunderous. Creation danced to a music only heaven could hear. And on the sixth day, the beasts of the earth were formed, each according to its kind. Then, in a hush deeper than silence, the image was made. From dust and divine breath, man stood both fragile and infinite, the meeting place of earth and eternity. The angel paused here in his telling, for this moment held weight beyond stars. God did not speak man into existence. He shaped him. He breathed into him. And thus, the seventh day came, not with work, but with rest, not because God was weary, but because all was complete. The Sabbath, he said, was not only for men, it was a crown placed upon creation, a holy rhythm echoing eternity. And Moses, hearing this, felt the dust beneath his feet differently. For now he knew the world was not simply made, it was sanctified. And the Sabbath still remembered what man so often forgets. In the sacred Garden of Eden, where every tree bore fruit and the rivers ran with life, Adam and Eve lived in the harmony of first creation. They walked in innocence beneath the canopy of divine light, tending the garden with joy and reverence. Each evening, the voice of the Creator would pass gently through the trees, and they would listen with awe, hearts unburdened by shame. But within Eden stood the tree of knowledge, guarded not by force but by command. It was not planted in anger but in wisdom, a boundary to teach obedience. The angel who guided Moses spoke of this moment with sorrow, for knowledge itself was not the curse, but the disobedience that brought it. The serpent, subtle in speech and form, approached Eve when the sun stood high. It did not command but questioned, "Has the Creator truly forbidden you from all the trees?" And thus began the unraveling. The seed of doubt bore fruit before any branch did. Eve, drawn by the allure of wisdom, tasted the fruit, and Adam soon after. And their eyes were open not to light, but to the starkness of their nakedness. Innocence departed not with force, but in silence. Fear crept into the garden. For the first time, Adam and Eve hid from the presence. When the Creator called, their response came not in joy, but in trembling. The judgment did not come as wrathful thunder, but with solemn decree: toil for man, pain for woman, and exile for both. Yet even in their exile, there was compassion, a covering of skins for their shame, a promise of return hidden in the sentence. East of Eden, they built their lives from the dust they once named. Adam tilled cursed ground, Eve bore sons with tears. But in the 7th week of years, they repented. Adam fasted for 40 days, and Eve for 34. Their repentance was not born of fear, but of longing for the garden, for the voice, for the peace they once knew. The Creator, ever merciful, recorded their prayer and sealed it in the heavenly tablets. Thus began the age of man, not in glory, but in hope. The angel told Moses, "These words are written so that you may teach your people to repent, to return." And so the story was passed down, not merely as memory, but as a warning and a promise, that even from the fall, a way back to the light remains. Time was not left adrift in chaos, nor were the days of men meant to wander without pattern. From the beginning, the Most High ordered creation with rhythm and measure, and with that rhythm came the wisdom of sacred time. To Moses, high upon the mountain and cloaked in the fire of divine presence, the angel of the presence unveiled not only the past but the divine order that governed it, the calendar of heaven itself. In the silence of that revelation, the angel spoke of Jubilee cycles of 49 years, and within them, weeks of years. Every event, every covenant, every unfolding of destiny moved within these appointed seasons. Nothing was by chance. The days of Adam, the flood of Noah, the calling of Abraham had occurred in the set time, within their ordained weeks. Time, then, was not merely passing. It was sacred, a vessel shaped by the hand of the Creator to carry the story of His will. The Sabbath, crowned as the first and most holy day, stood as the pillar of this divine structure. For 6 days the world had been formed, and on the 7th, the Creator rested not in weariness, but in completion. From that rest came the command, The seventh day shall be set apart, a sign between God and his people forever. The weeks, therefore, were not only human invention, but reflections of heavenly order. The angel explained that the children of Israel were to keep this calendar, to count their years not as the nations did, but as heaven had intended. For in the deviation of time came corruption. Festivals were forgotten, Sabbaths profaned, and covenant cycles broken. The Gentiles would follow the sun alone or the moon in isolation, but the righteous were to follow the Jubilee, a reckoning kept in the heavenly tablets, unshaken and eternal. Each Jubilee marked not only the passage of time, but the renewal of purpose. Every 7 weeks of years, debts were to be forgiven, slaves set free, land returned to its rightful families. In this, mercy was written into time itself. Just as the Creator had granted rest to creation, he commanded rest for man, beast, and earth alike. The calendar was justice made into rhythm, holiness woven into the fabric of seasons. And so Moses listened and wrote, not with his own mind, but with instruction from above. He was to teach the people that their days had meaning, that their history was not forgotten, and that their future must be shaped according to divine time. The Jubilee and the week were not merely units, but sacred sign-portals through which heaven touched earth. In this revelation, time itself was sanctified. The world would turn, empires would rise and fall, but the divisions of time as set forth on the mount would endure, unbroken and luminous, until the end of days. They were the sons of the first sorrow, born to a world already touched by exile. Cain, the tiller of the ground, and Abel, the shepherd of the flock, both carried in their hearts a longing to return to favor with the Creator. In time, both brought offerings before the Lord, Cain with the fruits of the earth he had toiled over, and Abel with the firstborn of his lambs, pure and unblemished. But the fire of heaven descended upon only one, and it was not Cain's. The silence that followed the rejected altar grew heavy in Cain's soul. Resentment, like a slow poison, turned his heart cold. The field became his sanctuary of vengeance, and there beneath the open sky without sword, without warning, Cain rose against his brother and spilled innocent blood into the dust. The earth drank Abel's life and trembled. It was the first time creation had tasted death by man's hand. Then came the voisinot in thunder, but with sorrow. Where is your brother Abel? Cain's answer echoed in eternity. Am I my brother's keeper? But there is no hiding from the one who sees all. The blood of Abel cried out from the ground, and its cry would never be silenced. For his crime, Cain was not killed but marked, not with death, but with exile. The ground, once his partner, now turned against him, refusing to yield its strength. He became a wanderer, a restless soul moving east of Eden. And with him went a shadow, not only of guilt, but of a legacy that would shape generations to come. Yet even in judgment, mercy was not absent. The mark placed upon Cain was a protection. No man would take vengeance, for vengeance belonged to the Lord alone. Cain built a city, a place of walls and distance, and there he fathered a line that would become mighty in works but distant from holiness. As for Adam and Eve, they mourned, not just the loss of Abel, but the fracturing of their family, the pain of knowing that their own flesh had turned against itself. But in time, the Creator gave them another son, Sethru, whom the hope of righteousness would live again. And so it was written in the heavenly tablets, that the first murder would not be forgotten, nor the cry of the innocent ignored. The consequence of sin was not only exile, but a world forever touched by sorrow. Cain's hands had shown what man was capable of when guided by envy and wrath, and the world would never be the same. The fields still whisper of Abel, and the earth still remembers. But even from bloodshed, the divine plan moved forward, shaping history not only through judgment but through grace. In the days when the sons of Adam began to multiply upon the earth, and the sound of toil echoed across valleys and mountains, there arose one whose soul did not cling to the dust. Enoch, son of Jared, walked not by the weight of the world, but by the rhythm of heaven. While others labored under the burden of survival, Enoch listened to the whisper of wind through trees, to the silence between the stars, to the voice that speaks in stillness. He was a man set apart, yet not by power or might. In his heart was no hunger for dominion, no thirst for praise. Instead, he sought the presence of the one who formed light and shadow, and so Enoch walked with God not as a prophet among men, but as a friend of the divine. In the quiet hours before dawn, visions would descend upon him, not born of dreams but of revelation. He saw the watchers in their descent, the secrets they gave to the daughters of men, the birth of giants and the trembling of creation beneath them. He beheld the tablets of heaven, where every deed, every thought, every breath of man was recorded with perfect clarity. Time opened before him like a scroll, and what he saw was not only the age of his fathers, but the future ages yet unborn. Angels came and spoke with him not in riddles, but in fire and clarity. They taught him the order of the stars, the names of the winds, the cycles of the earth. They revealed to him the boundaries of justice and the coming flood that would cleanse a world defiled by violence. And in the depths of his visions, he saw the throne of the Most High shrouded in flame, upheld by righteousness, surrounded by the seven spirits who serve with everlasting purpose. Though Enoch walked among men, his eyes often saw beyond them. They mocked his solitude, yet they feared his gaze. For in his presence was the echo of a higher realm, and in his words, the warning of judgment. But those who listened closely found not terror, but hope. For Enoch also spoke of mercy, of restoration, of a time when the earth would once again be clean, and when his days were complete, and the hour came for him to depart. He was not found among the graves of men, for God took him. No tomb held his bones, no shadow claimed his breath. He was lifted body, soul, and spirit into the realms beyond the stars, into the halls of flame and glory. From that day onward, the name of Enoch was spoken with reverence, for he had walked with God was no more. The earth, once a pristine canvas of divine artistry, now trembled under the weight of corruption. It was a time when the harmony of creation faltered, disturbed by the shadowy intrusion of the watcher's angelic beings who, under the leadership of Shemihaza, descended from their celestial heights. Their purpose was no longer one of observance but of rebellion. What had once been a harmonious creation was now to be altered by their unholy alliance with mortal women. In exchange for beauty and pleasures beyond comprehension, the Watchers shared with humankind forbidden knowledge secrets that led to great power but greater devastation. This union birthed the Nephilim, giants whose very existence threatened to unravel the world itself. These giants, mighty and seemingly invincible, began to roam the earth, their size and strength an overwhelming force. Their hearts, corrupted by their fallen fathers, thirsted for dominion, crushing anything that stood in their way. The natural world buckled beneath the weight of their presence. Forests were felled, and the once clear rivers grew murky with the blood spilled by their colossal feet. With every passing day, the earth groaned as the balance of creation shifted further from the divine plan. As the Nephilim grew in power, so too did the violence they wrought. Their hunger for more, for power, and for dominion drove them to take what they wanted, regardless of the cost to humanity or the earth itself. Villages were crushed under the weight of their greed, and the skies, once filled with songs of birds and the whispers of the wind, became filled with the cries of those who had no hope of escape. The angels who had descended to earth, now watching in silence, saw the corruption spread like a virus across creation, infecting both the heavens and the earth below. Amid this chaos, Michael, the archangel and divine champion, could not remain silent. He watched the world tremble beneath the growing corruption, and his heart, filled with both love for creation and the righteous fire of justice, burned with a need to intervene. The Watchers had abandoned their celestial purpose, and their progenitive Nephilim grew as embodiments of defiance against the Creator. Michael understood that to restore balance, a terrible reckoning would be required. But even as Michael prepared for his inevitable confrontation, a deep sorrow weighed upon him. The earth had been beautiful, vibrant with life and love, and yet now it languished in the shadows of sin. There was no turning back from the damage that had been done, and the restoration of divine order would require sacrifice. Michael's sword, forged from the very light of heaven, would soon clash with the very forces that had once been part of the celestial choir. The struggle between light and darkness, between the sacred and the profane, had begun. It was a battle that would echo throughout eternity, and its scars would be felt by all of creation. The world had sunk deep into the abyss of corruption. The Nephilim's reign was merciless, and the earth cried out in agony as the violence and destruction surged across every corner of creation. Humanity, once a beautiful and harmonious part of the divine design, now faced its greatest trial. Those who had remained faithful were few, scattered and broken, their voices drowned by the monstrous power of the giants and the watchers who had once been guardians but had now become the architects of decay. Amidst this chaos, a single man stood as a beacon of hope: Noah. His name had been whispered by the winds of the earth, a man who had walked humbly before God, untouched by the vile currents that had consumed the hearts of so many. Yet, even he could not escape the grief that weighed heavy upon his soul. The land he once knew, lush and fertile, was now scorched and broken under the weight of the Nephilim's footfalls. Still, Noah had never wavered in his faith, and it was to him that the Creator chose to speak. One night, as Noah sat beneath the stars, gazing at a sky now clouded with the dust of destruction, a voice broke the silence. It was not the first time he had heard it, but this time the message was different. It was a divine summons, a command from the Creator himself. The voice told Noah of the coming flood, a deluge that would sweep over the earth, purging it of its corruption. This flood would bring the end of the age, a cleansing that would restore the balance that had been lost. But Noah, though he had heard the warnings before, had never imagined something so profound would come to pass. The command was clear: build an ark, a vessel large enough to carry his family, along with every kind of animal, so that they might be preserved from the coming storm. Noah's heart swelled with both awe and sorrow, for he understood that this was not simply a call to survival but to preservation. The earth would be destroyed, but a new world would rise from the waters. He had been chosen not just to save his own life, but to safeguard the essence of creation itself. Noah's hands began their work. The ark would be immense, built to hold life in all its forms. But it was not just wood and pitch that would make it strong. It was the faith that guided each strike of his hammer, each measure of its vast proportions. And though Noah was mocked, ridiculed for his belief in a judgment so far removed from their understanding, he continued with quiet resolve. He knew the flood would come. He had seen it in his dreams, heard it in the silence that enveloped him in those lonely moments of prayer. The world outside might laugh, might remain oblivious, but Noah had already seen the signs. The flood was not just a force of nature, it was the beginning of something new. The Creator's promise, though shrouded in the shadows of judgment, was also one of renewal, and Noah, though he carried the weight of the world's destruction, also carried the hope for the future. With every plank he placed, the foundation of a new world was born. The sky, once vast and clear, now brooded with dark clouds. The winds, heavy with the scent of impending change, howled as if warning the world of the storm to come. For 40 days and 40 nights, the heavens would pour their fury upon the earth, and no place would remain untouched. The flood, both a judgment and a mercy, was about to begin. In that time, everything known to humankind, every creature that walked, crawled, or flew, would be swept away. The land that had once borne the fruits of life would now bear only the weight of divine wrath, and all that was corrupted would be washed clean. Noah, standing at the threshold of the ark, could feel the weight of the coming deluge pressing down on him. His family had gathered inside, the animals settled in their pens, each pair of creatures nestled together, waiting in silence. The ark was sealed, not by his own hands, but by the command of the Creator. It was an act of divine will, a sign that the Creator had ordained this moment, had sealed the fate of the world, and now Noah was simply the instrument of that will. As the first raindrops fell, they seemed small, almost innocent, but the sky darkened further, and the heavens released torrents of water, flooding the earth with a ferocity that would not be stilled. The rivers that once flowed gently over the land now surged, filling the valleys and hills, creeping up to swallow the cities, the homes, the villages. The cries of the lost echoed across the waves, but no one could hear them. No one but Noah, who sat in quiet prayer, knowing that the waters had come not only to end, but to begin anew. The creatures, once free to roam the earth, were now trapped within the ark, safe from the floodwaters but caught in a strange silence. They had been gathered 2 by 2 from every corner of the world, chosen by Noah's faith and obedience. The world had changed, but the ark, a small island in a sea of chaos, was a sanctuary, a last hope. Inside, Noah and his family listened as the storm raged outside. The roar of the wind, the crash of thunder, the heavy patter of rain, it all became a chorus of divine power, a reminder that creation was not as man had shaped it, but as the Creator had designed it from the beginning. The flood continued, relentless in its rise. The mountains, once towering in the distance, were swallowed by the dark, churning waters. The land was unrecognizable, consumed by the very element that had once sustained it. For the first time in a long while, Noah felt small. The weight of the world's sins had been carried by the waters, and he, like all of creation, was left to witness it unfold. As the ark bobbed upon the waves, the flood was not only cleansing the earth, it was the beginning of something new. There was a heavy stillness in the heart of the storm, a promise that, though the world had been broken, it could one day be restored, and that, in time, the floodwaters would recede. The earth would heal, a new creation would emerge, and humanity would begin again. As the floodwaters began to recede and the ark came to rest upon the mountaintop, Noah emerged from the refuge of the vessel, stepping onto a world that had been cleansed, renewed, and remade by divine judgment. The silence was almost deafening, no sounds of life, no distant calls of birds or rustling leaves. The land, once rich with the voices of creation, was now still, as if holding its breath, waiting for the moment to begin again. Noah and his family, along with the animals, stood together on that mountaintop, each one caught between the weight of what had been lost and the hope of what was to come. They had survived the storm, but now the true test began, the covenant that had been promised by the Creator, the divine agreement that would shape the future of humanity and the earth. As Noah made his offerings to the Lord, the smoke rising from the altar was a sign, a symbol of gratitude and reverence. The aroma reached the heavens, a sweet offering to the one who had both spared and judged the world. And in response, a voice, both gentle and commanding, echoed through the quiet skies. It was the voice of the Creator, speaking to Noah and to all generations who would follow. "I have set my bow in the clouds," the voice proclaimed, "and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I again destroy every living thing as I have done." The promise was clear. The flood, though an act of judgment, was also a demonstration of mercy. The Creator would never again wipe the earth clean in such a way. The rainbow, shining brightly in the sky as the storm clouds parted, became the visible token of that covenant, a reminder to all of creation, not just to Noah and his family, but to every living thing that the earth would never again face the same destruction. The rainbow was not simply a symbol of peace, but a mark of divine faithfulness, a bridge between the Creator and his creation. It was the promise that even though humanity would still face challenges, and though the world would continue to experience the scars of sin, there would always be a way forward. Noah, standing beneath the brilliant arc of light, understood the weight of this covenant. It was not just for him, but for all the generations to come. Humanity had been given another chance, another opportunity to live in harmony with the earth, to honor the divine order, and to grow in understanding. And as the rainbow arced across the sky, Noah felt a deep, unspoken sense of peace settle over him. The world, broken and remade, was beginning anew, and in the promise of the rainbow, there was hope that would endure through the ages. As the years passed after the flood, Noah and his sons began to repopulate the earth. The world, once cleansed by the waters of divine judgment, now lay before them, vast and empty, awaiting the touch of humanity's hand. From the mountaintop where the ark had rested, they gazed upon the land stretching far and wide, each one feeling the weight of their father's promise and the vast responsibility laid upon them. Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, were the foundation of this new world, and each would play a vital role in the repopulation and division of the earth. The Creator, having established this new beginning, looked upon them and decreed that the earth be divided among them. Each son and his descendants would take their own portion, shaping the future of the nations to come. It was a solemn moment when Noah, now the patriarch, called his sons together and shared with them the divine will. They were to spread out across the earth, to claim their territories, and to establish themselves as leaders of the new nations. Shem, the eldest, would inherit the lands to the east, where the rising sun touched the earth first. Ham, the second son, would inherit the lands to the south, and Japheth, the youngest, would claim the vast northern territories. Each of them was entrusted with the stewardship of their respective portions, charged with guiding their descendants to live in accordance with the Creator's laws. Shem's descendants would eventually become the ancestors of the Semitic peoples, their legacy intertwined with the faith of Abraham and the birth of Israel. Ham's descendants, on the other hand, would spread across the African continent, establishing kingdoms and empires that would become the heart of great civilizations. Japheth's lineage, reaching into the northern lands, would become the fathers of nations across Europe and beyond, spreading their influence across the wide and varied lands. Though their territories were distinct, the ties between them were unbroken. The brothers' descendants would meet, trade, and sometimes clash, but the land itself was divided in a way that ensured the earth would remain a complex tapestry of cultures, each contributing to the whole of creation. The Creator had not abandoned them. Rather, He had set them on their paths, each family destined to become a thread in the fabric of humanity's story. Noah, now growing older, watched as his sons began to settle in their allotted lands, each one founding cities and families. He knew that, though the floodwaters had receded and the world had been remade, there were still trials ahead for his descendants. The earth had been divided, but its future remained uncertain. Only time would tell how his sons' offspring would fulfill the promises of their Creator. But in that moment, as the sun rose over the newly divided lands, there was a sense of peace. The promise had been kept, and the earth was once again filled with life and hope. The story of humanity was only just beginning, and with it, the legacy of Noah and his sons would echo through the ages. In the days following the great flood, humanity, once again united under the descendants of Noah, began to multiply and spread across the earth. The new world was full of promise and potential, but as the generations grew, so too did the ambitions of mankind. In the land of Shinar, a great city began to take shape, its people united by a singular, bold vision. They sought to make a name for themselves, to build a tower that would reach to the heavens, an edifice that would stand as a monument to their power and their pride. The people of this new world were skilled builders and dreamers. With their collective strength, they forged brick and bitumen, lifting stones to the skies, determined to touch the realm of the divine. The tower grew taller with each passing year, its spires reaching for the heavens as a symbol of human achievement. But with each brick laid, there was a growing arrogance in the hearts of the builders. They no longer saw their creation as a tool for unity or worship, but as an expression of their dominance over the earth and the heavens. In their ambition, they sought to make themselves like the Creator, reaching into the domain of the divine, seeking to make their name great so that no one would ever forget their glory. Yet, this ambition was not without consequence. The Creator, seeing the pride in the hearts of mankind, descended to observe their work. What he saw was a people bent on self-exaltation, their unity not in love or purpose, but in their desire to prove their strength against the heavens. It was a challenge to the divine order, a rebellion against the humility that had been set before them. In their unity, they had forgotten the lesson of the flood, the lesson that the earth was not theirs to command, but to steward with wisdom and reverence. In an act of divine justice and mercy, the Creator decided to intervene. With a single word, he scattered the people of the tower, confusing their language so that they could no longer understand one another. No longer able to communicate, the builders were forced to abandon their great project. The tower, once a beacon of human pride, now stood unfinished, a reminder of the folly of ambition unchecked by humility. The people who had once been united in their goal now spread across the earth, their languages fractured, their bonds broken. They settled in different regions, their communities growing apart as they took on new identities, each group bearing the mark of the Creator's intervention. And so, the great Tower of Babel became a symbol not of human achievement, but of the limits of pride and the need for humility in the face of divine authority. The story of Babel became a reminder to all who came after, that no matter how great the ambition, no man can challenge the heavens without consequence. The Creator's plan would continue, and though mankind might seek to rise above their place, they would always be reminded of their dependence on him. The great city of Shinar, once a beacon of human unity, now lay fractured and scattered. The towering structure that had once soared proudly toward the heavens stood incomplete, its purpose lost to the wind. The people, once bound by a shared vision of glory, found themselves divided. No longer could they speak to one another in a common tongue, their words now a jumble of confusion and misunderstanding. It was a moment of divine silence, as if the Creator himself had spoken without uttering a word. In this fractured silence, the world began its transformation. As the people migrated, each group took its place in the world, spreading across distant lands, forming tribes, nations, and cultures. They would never forget the ambition that had united them, nor the fall that had scattered them. The remnants of their once great project, the tower, became a solemn reminder of the power of unity and pride, but more so, the danger of ignoring the Creator's will. Though the people could no longer communicate as they once had, the lesson of Babel lingered, passed down through generations as a warning to those who would follow in their footsteps. The earth, once again populated, began to heal, but the scars of humanity's pride remained. It was as though the very foundation of the world had been shaken by the events of Babel, and in the aftermath, a new world was born, one where people would always be divided by language, culture, and the memories of their shared sin. It was a world in which the divine authority was felt, not in the unity of mankind, but in the quiet reminders of divine judgment. In the years that followed, the children of Babel looked up at the remnants of the tower, and perhaps some of them remembered the pride that had led their ancestors to such great heights. The world would never forget the day when the Creator scattered the people of Babel, nor the day when their ambition was humbled by the very power they sought to defy. And so, the story of Babel lives on, not just as a tale of a broken tower, but as a story of divine sovereignty and human humility. It is a reminder that no matter how far mankind may reach, no matter how high they may build, the Creator's hand is never far behind, guiding and shaping the world according to His will. The tower may have fallen, but the lesson it imparted remains etched in the hearts of all who remember. In the land of Ur, a city of great wealth and power, Terah, the father of Abraham, lived in the shadow of idols. His household was filled with images of gods, crafted from stone, wood, and metal, each representing a different aspect of life fertility, harvest, and protection. These idols were not just symbols. They were revered, worshipped, and treated as the very source of blessings for the family. Terah, a respected man in his community, had been a servant of these false gods for as long as he could remember. His life was bound to them, and his legacy, he believed, would be built upon the favor they granted. But in the heart of Terah's household, a young man named Abraham began to question. As a boy, he had been taught to honor the idols, to make offerings, and to kneel before the statues that adorned his father's house. Yet, something stirred in his soul. The idols, he realized, were powerless. They had no voice, no movement, no capacity to bring life or to protect. How could something made by human hands hold power over those who had created them? Abraham began to seek answers beyond the teachings of his father and the traditions of his people. One day, as Terah prepared to leave his home for business, Abraham was left alone in the house. The silence weighed heavily on him, and the multitude of idols around him seemed to mock his thoughts. He could not understand how anyone could bow before these lifeless forms, how they could attribute divinity to mere creations of their own hands. Filled with a deep sense of conviction, Abraham did the unthinkable. He took a hammer and destroyed every idol in the house, leaving only the largest and most imposing one intact. Then, he placed the hammer in the hand of the statue, as though it were the one responsible for the destruction of the others. When Terah returned and saw the ruin of his household, his anger boiled over. His gods had been desecrated, and in his eyes, it was an unforgivable act. He demanded to know who had committed such sacrilege. With a calm yet resolute voice, Abraham replied, "It was the great God who did this. He destroyed them because they are powerless. He is the true God." Terah, incredulous, scoffed at his son. "Do you dare mock the gods of my ancestors?" he thundered. "These idols have served us for generations." But Abraham stood firm in his conviction. "If they are gods, let them defend themselves," he declared. "For I believe in the one who created the heavens and the earth. The idols are nothing, and I will not bow before them." In that moment, Abraham boldly proclaimed his faith in the one true God, rejecting the false gods of his father and his people. His challenge to Terah's idolatry marked the beginning of his journey, a journey that would lead him to become the father of a great nation, a nation built not on idols, but on the worship of the living God. And though his father would never see the truth as Abraham did, the seeds of change had been planted, and the idols of would fall into oblivion as the story of Abraham's faith began to unfold. Abraham stood at the edge of his home, the familiar city of fading into the distance behind him. The journey ahead was uncertain, a path that stretched far beyond what he had ever known, yet something in his heart burned with a quiet certainty. He had heard the voice, the call that would change everything, a voice not of man but of God. It called him to leave the land of his fathers, to walk away from everything he had ever known, to embark on a journey not to a place, but toward a promise of a new beginning, a future beyond his own imagining. With his wife Sarah at his side, and his nephew Lot following along, Abraham gathered his belongings and left behind the city that had cradled his family for generations. The people of had long been known for their prosperity and their devotion to the idols that lined their temples. But Abraham, now marked by the revelation of the true God, could not stay among them. He had seen the power of the Creator, and it was unlike anything the idols could offer. He could no longer live in the shadow of false gods. His heart was set on following the voice that had spoken to him. The road ahead was difficult. They traveled through the vast desert lands, leaving behind the comforts of their former life. Abraham, once a man of wealth and status, became a wanderer. Yet, in the depths of his soul, he felt a peace that surpassed the uncertainties of his journey. He was not alone. He carried the promise of God's presence with him. Though the way was long and the dangers real, Abraham trusted that the promise would be fulfilled. Every step he took was one of faith. Along the way, Abraham came to a place where the land stretched out before him like an untouched canvas. Here God spoke again, saying, "To your descendants I will give this land." It was a simple promise, yet it held the weight of the world. Abraham looked out over the rolling hills and barren stretches, knowing that one day his children would call this land their home. But at that moment, it was his alone to witness, his alone to believe in. As they continued on their journey, Abraham's faith was tested. There were times when the food was scarce, and the challenges seemed insurmountable. But every trial was a lesson in trust, a deepening of his reliance on the God who had called him. Through the hardships and the unknown, Abraham carried the knowledge that his journey was not just about reaching a destination was about living the promise of the one who had spoken to him, a promise that would unfold through generations to come. Abraham's heart remained steadfast, for he knew that this call, this journey, was the beginning of something eternal. The land he sought would not only be a place for his descendants, but a place where the world would witness the faithfulness of God, and through him, the whole earth would be blessed. This was not just a journey to a promised land. It was the beginning of a new covenant with the Creator. As Abraham journeyed through the land, following the call of God with unwavering faith, the promise that had been given to him began to take root within his soul. Though he had not yet seen the full extent of the promise fulfilled, Abraham carried within him the conviction that God's word was true and that one day his descendants would inherit the land. But in this journey of faith, God sought to establish a deeper connection, a sign that would serve as a reminder not just to Abraham, but to all his descendants of the covenant that bound them together. One evening, as the stars twinkled above the encampment, God spoke to Abraham once again. The voice, as clear and certain as ever, declared that this covenant would be sealed in a way that would remain with him forever. The promise was not just a distant hope, but a present reality. It was a bond that would transcend generations, one that would not be forgotten. In this sacred moment, God instructed Abraham to mark himself and all the males of his household with a physical sign mark of the covenant, a symbol of the eternal bond between them and their Creator. Abraham, though astonished by the command, did not hesitate. His faith had been tested many times before, and now it was being tested in a new and profound way. The act of circumcision would be a painful one, but it was one that carried great significance. It was not merely a physical change, but a spiritual act of submission, a visible mark of Abraham's obedience to God and the commitment to uphold the covenant. As instructed, Abraham took his son Ishmael and all the men in his household and performed the circumcision. Each incision was a symbol of trust, each drop of blood a sign of devotion to the promise made so many years ago. Though the act was filled with sacrifice and physical pain, it was also filled with joy and purpose. The covenant was no longer an abstract concept, but a living, breathing reality. This act would be passed down through the generations, from father to son, a living testimony to God's faithfulness. It would be the mark by which God's people would be recognized, not by their strength or their wealth, but by their relationship with the divine. For centuries to come, the children of Abraham would carry this mark, a reminder that they were set apart, chosen to carry the promises of God to the world. Through this covenant of circumcision, God reaffirmed his commitment to Abraham and his descendants, promising that they would be his people and he would be their God. It was a bond sealed not by words alone, but by action, a covenant written into the very bodies of his people. And for Abraham, this mark became a sign of the divine promise, a promise that would endure for all generations, a promise that would ultimately bless the entire world. The day was like any other, yet beneath the surface, the weight of divine justice loomed heavy over the wicked cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. These cities, once thriving and filled with life, had become riddled with sin. Their inhabitants had turned from the ways of righteousness, their hearts hardened by pride, greed, and debauchery. Every corner of Sodom seemed to pulse with corruption, and every action within its walls was driven by selfishness and perversion. Heaven had watched, and the time had come for the reckoning. Lot, Abraham's nephew, lived in Sodom. He had long known of the city's depravity, yet had chosen to settle among them, perhaps hoping for some form of redemption for the place or simply bound by the comforts of his life. But Lot's heart had always remained distant from the corruption that surrounded him, and deep down, he had always known that judgment would come one day. That day was now. As the sun began to dip beneath the horizon, 2 angels arrived in the city, disguised as men. They sought out Lot, and as he welcomed them into his home, he could feel the tension rise. He knew that the city was on the brink, but he could not have fathomed how swiftly the storm would come. As night fell, the city's men young and old alike gathered outside his house, driven by a ravenous desire to harm the guests. They demanded that Lot hand over the angels, exposing the depths of their corruption. Lot, desperate to protect his guests, offered his daughters in their place. But the men were unmoved by his words. Their depravity was too deep, their rage too wild. The angels, seeing the perversion of Sodom in its fullness, struck the crowd with blindness, and at that moment, the truth could no longer be denied. The city had passed the point of no return. The angels instructed Lot to gather his family and flee the city. The time had come to leave Sodom, for its destruction was imminent. Lot hesitated, torn between the city he had known and the unknown future that awaited him. But the angels urged him to leave, and so Lot, his wife, and 2 daughters fled, urged by the angels to look not back. As they fled, fire and brimstone rained down upon the cities, consuming Sodom and Gomorrah in a swift and fiery judgment. The heavens opened, and the earth below trembled as the cities were destroyed in an instant. The destruction was complete, an act of divine purification, a judgment upon sin and the unchecked evil that had taken root. As the smoke rose from the ashes, Lot's wife, unable to resist, glanced back at the burning city, and in that moment, she was turned into a pillar of salt. Her longing for the life she had left behind had cost her the chance at salvation. In the aftermath, Lot and his daughters were left alone, survivors of a world lost to its own wickedness. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah would echo through the ages, a stark reminder that no sin, no matter how deep or widespread, could go unpunished. Heaven had spoken, and the cities of depravity were no more. The earth would bear the scars of their judgment, and humanity would remember that divine justice is both merciful and final. Abraham had walked with God for many years, his heart bound to the divine promise that had been given to him. His life had been marked by moments of great faith, and each step he took had been in obedience to the Creator who had called him out of Ur. But there was one test that awaited him, one challenge that would stretch the limits of his faith in ways he could not yet comprehend. It would come when he least expected it and demand more than any father could bear. One quiet morning, as Abraham stood in the peace of his tent, a voice called to him from heaven. It was not a voice of comfort or promise, but one of command. "Abraham," it said, "take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. There, offer him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you." The words struck Abraham like a thunderclap, reverberating through his soul. Isaac, the child of promise, the one through whom the covenant would be fulfilled, was to be offered as a sacrifice? The shock was immediate, but the obedience was even swifter. No words of protest passed Abraham's lips. His faith had been built upon a foundation of trust in the Creator, and though the command seemed incomprehensible, he trusted that the God who had promised him a legacy would not fail him now. Without hesitation, Abraham gathered the necessary supplies: the wood for the fire, the knife for the sacrifice, and set out on the journey with Isaac and 2 servants. The journey to Moriah was long, but each step was taken with a heart heavy with sorrow and yet unwavering in trust. As they neared the mountain, Abraham instructed the servants to wait at the base, taking only Isaac with him to the top. "The boy and I will go yonder to worship, and we will return to you," he said, his words echoing the faith that still burned within him. As they ascended the mountain, Isaac, puzzled by the absence of a lamb for the sacrifice, turned to his father and asked, "Where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham's answer was simple but full of trust. "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." When they reached the summit, Abraham built the altar, arranged the wood, and bound Isaac, placing him upon the altar. His hands trembled as he raised the knife, ready to carry out the unthinkable. In that moment, a stillness fell over everything. The world seemed to hold its breath, and then, just as Abraham prepared to sacrifice Isaac, a voice rang out from heaven. "Abraham! Abraham!" He stopped, his heart racing, and the voice continued. "Do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Abraham looked up, and there, caught in a thicket by its horns, was a ram. God had provided the sacrifice, sparing Isaac's life and confirming the depth of Abraham's faith. The mountain, forever afterward called Jehovah-Jireh, would stand as a testament to God's provision and to the unwavering faith of a father who was willing to give everything, trusting that God would never ask more than he was willing to give. The years had passed, and Sarah, the woman who had walked beside Abraham through trials, promises, and the fulfillment of God's word, now lay at the end of her earthly journey. The laughter that had once echoed in the tents of their home was now silenced by the grief of loss. She was the mother of Isaac, the one through whom the covenant promise would continue, and her death marked the end of a significant chapter in Abraham's life. Abraham, though seasoned by years of faith, now stood before the greatest sorrow he had known. He had seen God's promises come to fruition, from the birth of Isaac to the blessings and trials that had accompanied their long walk. Yet, in this moment, the great patriarch of faith was a father mourning the loss of his beloved wife, his partner in the promise, the one who had shared the vision of a new nation, a new people. Sarah's death took place in the land of Canaan, in the town of Kiriath Arba, now known as Hebron. As Abraham sat by her side, the weight of the years pressed upon him. He had seen so many things, but this finality was different. The love they shared, the years of laughter, tears, and shared faith, had come to a close. In that moment, Abraham wept for his wife, his heart breaking not just for the loss of her presence, but for the future without her by his side. Yet, even in the face of this grief, Abraham knew the importance of what he must do. His heart, though shattered by the loss, was still full of the promises of God. He knew that he needed to secure a proper place of rest for Sarah, a place that would honor her life and her role in the story God was weaving for their descendants. Abraham rose and went to the Hittites, the people who lived in the land, seeking a burial site for Sarah. He approached the elders of the city, acknowledging their authority and asking for a piece of land to bury his wife. The Hittites, seeing the respect Abraham held for their people, graciously offered him any tomb he desired. But Abraham, with wisdom and reverence, asked for the cave of Machpelah, a specific site that belonged to Ephron, the son of Zohar. Ephron, seeing Abraham's grief, offered to give the cave to him, but Abraham insisted on purchasing it. He refused to take it as a gift, understanding that this land, which would one day become the possession of his descendants, needed to be secured through a rightful transaction. After a fair exchange, the cave of Machpelah became the burial place for Sarah, and Abraham laid her to rest there with a heavy heart. In the days that followed, Abraham mourned deeply, but he also knew that the path ahead, though filled with sorrow, was not the end of the promises made to him. Sarah's death marked the passing of a generation, but her legacy would live on in Isaac and in the generations that followed. As Abraham stood over her grave, he held in his heart the faith that had carried him through all his trials, that God's promises would endure, and that this land, which he now mourned over, would one day belong to his children and children's children. Abraham's heart still mourned the loss of Sarah, but life, as it often does, pressed forward. Isaac, his only son, was now a young man, carrying the promise of the covenant within him. Abraham knew that his son's future was intertwined with the promise of God, and the time had come for Isaac to take a wife. It was a moment that would shape the next generation, a union that would continue the legacy of the covenant. And Abraham, knowing the weight of it, sought the guidance of the Lord. Abraham summoned his most trusted servant, Eliezer, and charged him with a task that was more than a simple search for a wife. He asked the servant to journey to his homeland, to the city of Nahor, where Abraham had once lived, to find a suitable wife for Isaac from among his kin. Abraham made it clear that the woman must be one who would be willing to leave her family and her life behind, to join Isaac in a new land, to embrace the promises of God's covenant. Eliezer, though loyal and faithful, was filled with trepidation at such a great responsibility. What if he could not find the right woman? What if she refused to come back with him? But Abraham, in his wisdom, reassured him, speaking of the faithfulness of God. "The Lord will send his angel before you," Abraham said, "and you will find the woman whom God has chosen." Abraham believed that God would provide, that his plan was already in motion, and that Eliezer's journey would not be in vain. So, Eliezer set off on his journey, traveling to the distant land where Abraham had once lived. When he arrived, he prayed to the Lord for guidance, asking for a sign that would show him the right woman for Isaac. He prayed that the woman who offered him water from the well and also watered his camels would be the one chosen by God. As Eliezer approached the well, his eyes scanned the women who had gathered there, and it was then that he saw Rebekah. She was kind and generous, offering him water from the well and, without hesitation, offering to water his camels as well. Eliezer's heart stirred with the confirmation of the Lord's promise, and he knew in that moment that Rebekah was the one chosen to be Isaac's wife. Eliezer went to her family and spoke of his mission, and Rebekah's family, after some discussion, agreed that it was the will of God for her to marry Isaac. And so, Rebekah, with the blessing of her family, left her home and journeyed back with Eliezer to Canaan. When Rebekah saw Isaac from a distance, she alighted from her camel and asked who he was. Eliezer, smiling, replied, "That is my master." Rebekah covered her face with a veil, as was customary, and approached Isaac. Their meeting was quiet, filled with the weight of a divine promise that had brought them together. Isaac, seeing the woman who would be his wife, took her into his tent, and she became his wife, and he loved her deeply. The marriage of Isaac and Rebekah was not just a union of two people, but a union that carried the weight of the covenant, the continuation of the promises made to Abraham. It was a sacred joining, blessed by God, that would lead to the birth of sons, who would carry forward the lineage of the promise, and the story of God's covenant with his people would continue to unfold. Rebekah, now settled in the home of Isaac, carried within her the hope of continuing the covenant made with Abraham. Yet, as the days passed, the promise seemed delayed. Rebekah felt a strange unrest within her, an unusual stirring that grew stronger with each passing week. She prayed to the Lord, seeking understanding for the discomfort that consumed her. God, in his mercy, answered her prayer, revealing to her the cause of her distress. In a vision, the Lord spoke to her, declaring that the struggle within her womb was no ordinary trial. Two nations were vying for dominance. Two peoples were at war even before their birth. The elder would serve the younger, and one would be stronger than the other. Rebekah, in awe of the revelation, understood that her sons were to play a significant role in God's plan, and the future of nations would rest upon their shoulders. The pregnancy, now marked by tension and movement, culminated in the birth of twins. Esau, the firstborn, emerged covered in red hair, his body a striking contrast to his twin brother, Jacob, whose grip on Esau's heel seemed to signify a struggle that had begun long before their birth. Esau, with his fiery red hair and strong, rugged features, grew to be a man of the field, skilled in hunting and the outdoors. Jacob, quieter and more contemplative, preferred the comfort of the tents, where he worked alongside his mother, learning the ways of the household. As they grew, the difference in their personalities became more apparent. Isaac, their father, favored Esau for his strength and skill as a hunter. He delighted in the wild game that Esau brought home, and there was a bond between them, one of shared interests and love for the outdoors. Rebekah, however, loved Jacob more. She saw in him something deeper, something that would carry forward the promise of God's covenant. She knew that the prophecy spoken over them was true, that Jacob would one day rise to hold the blessing of their father. The tension between the brothers began to take shape when Esau, weary from a hunt, returned to the camp to find Jacob cooking a pot of stew. Esau, famished and impatient, asked for some of the food, but Jacob, ever calculating, saw an opportunity. He offered the stew, but only in exchange for Esau's birthright, the firstborn's privileged position. Esau, driven by his hunger and disregard for the sacredness of his birthright, agreed. With a careless oath, Esau sold his birthright to Jacob for a simple meal. Though the bargain seemed trivial at the time, it was the beginning of a deep rift between the two brothers. The covenant that had been promised to Abraham was now being carried forward through Jacob, the younger, as God had foretold. And though the birthright was bought with a bowl of stew, it set the stage for the struggles, deceptions, and blessings that would shape the lives of these two brothers and the nations that would descend from them. As time passed, the growing tension between Esau and Jacob manifested not only in their actions but in their hearts. Isaac, now an old man, grew frail and his sight began to fade. His once powerful presence was now weakened, and he felt that his days on earth were drawing to a close. With the end in sight, Isaac called for Esau, his firstborn son, to receive the blessing that was his by birthright. The blessing was not just a mere ritual, but a divine transmission of promise, of the covenant God had made with Abraham, and now it was to be passed to the one who would carry that legacy forward. Isaac told Esau to go hunting, to prepare the finest game he could find, and bring it to him so that he might eat and bless him before he died. Esau, eager to receive his father's blessing, set off immediately. But Rebekah, ever watchful and aware of the prophecy that had been spoken over her sons, saw this as an opportunity to secure the blessing for Jacob, the son she loved most. She knew the time had come for her younger son to receive what God had promised. Rebekah quickly devised a plan. She called Jacob to her and told him of Isaac's request for Esau. "I will prepare the meal your father desires," she said. "Then you must bring it to him and receive the blessing in place of your brother." Jacob, though hesitant, voiced his concern. "But mother, Esau is hairy, and I am smooth. If father touches me, he will know that I am not Esau." Rebekah, confident in her resolve, took the matter into her own hands. She dressed Jacob in Esau's clothes and covered his hands and neck with the skins of goats to mimic the roughness of Esau's hair. With the food ready, Jacob went to his father, heart pounding in his chest, uncertainty gnawing at him. Isaac, hearing the voice of Jacob but feeling the disguise of Esau, was initially suspicious. "How did you find the game so quickly?" Isaac asked, his voice trembling. Jacob, playing the role of Esau, lied, saying that the Lord had granted him success in the hunt. Isaac, still unsure, reached out and touched Jacob, feeling the goat skins, and his suspicions were allayed. "The voice is the voice of Jacob," Isaac muttered, "but the hands are the hands of Esau." In that moment, Isaac, his vision dimmed and his mind clouded by age, gave in. He blessed Jacob, unknowingly sealing the fate of the birthright and the divine promise that was meant for Esau. The words of blessing were powerful, and as they left Isaac's lips, they could not be undone. Jacob, having received the blessing of his father, left swiftly, feeling a mix of triumph and guilt, his heart still heavy. He knew the consequences of his actions would soon unfold. When Esau returned, bearing his game and ready to receive his blessing, it was too late. The blessing, meant for him by birthright, had been given to his brother. His anger and disbelief tore at him, but there was nothing he could do. The deed was done, and the covenant was now passed on to Jacob, the one whom God had chosen. Fleeing from the wrath of his brother Esau, Jacob set out on a journey that would change the course of his life. His deceit had earned him Esau's fury, and his mother, Rebekah, fearing for his life, urged him to flee to her brother Laban's house in Haran. As Jacob traveled through the barren wilderness, the weight of his actions pressed heavily on his heart. He had taken the birthright, the blessing, and the promise meant for Esau, and now he was alone, far from the comfort of his family, with only the wilderness stretching before him. The night grew cold, and Jacob found a place to rest. He gathered a stone for his head, seeking some solace as sleep overtook him. In the stillness of the night, as his body lay upon the earth, his spirit was lifted into a vision, a dream that would etch itself into the fabric of his life. As he slept, Jacob saw a ladder, its base resting on the ground, its top reaching all the way to the heavens. And on this ladder, he saw the angels of God ascending and descending. Their movement was fluid, as if they were messengers between the realms of heaven and earth, conveying the will of God. At the top of the ladder stood the Lord himself, whose voice thundered through the dream with a message of divine assurance and promise. "I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac," the voice declared. "The land on which you lie, I will give to you and your descendants. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, spreading west and east, north and south. Through you and your offspring, all the families of the earth will be blessed." The promise that had been made to Abraham and Isaac was now being extended to Jacob. Despite his faults and his deception, God had chosen him to carry the covenant forward. His journey would not be one of mere exile or wandering, but one marked by divine purpose and protection. Jacob's heart trembled at the sight of the vision, and as the Lord spoke, he assured Jacob that he would be with him, guarding him wherever he went, and bringing him back to this very land. "I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you," the Lord said, offering Jacob a promise of divine faithfulness that stretched beyond his understanding. Awakening from the dream, Jacob was filled with awe and wonder. "Surely the Lord is in this place," he murmured, "and I did not know it." The weight of his deception, though still there, was now tempered by the recognition of the divine call upon his life. He took the stone he had used as a pillow and set it up as a pillar, pouring oil upon it as an offering. "This stone will be the house of God," he declared, and he vowed to return to this place if God would indeed keep his promises. With the vision in his heart and the divine promise ringing in his ears, Jacob continued on his journey, forever changed by the vision of the ladder that connected heaven and earth. Jacob's journey took him to Haran, where he found refuge with his uncle Laban, the brother of his mother Rebekah. It was there that his destiny would be shaped by love, rivalry, and divine intervention. Jacob, having fled from his past, soon encountered Rachel, Laban's younger daughter, and it was love at first sight. She was beautiful, with a grace that caught his heart immediately. He knew in his heart that she was the one with whom he would build his future. But Laban, a shrewd and crafty man, saw an opportunity for himself in the union of his daughter and his nephew. Jacob agreed to work for Laban for 7 years in exchange for Rachel's hand in marriage. Those years seemed to pass in the blink of an eye, for his love for Rachel made the work lighter, the days shorter. But when the time came for the marriage, Laban tricked Jacob. Under the veil of darkness and ceremony, Laban switched his daughters, giving Jacob Leah, the older and less loved sister, instead. Jacob, who had been deceived just as he had once deceived his father Isaac, was furious. But Laban justified his actions by stating that it was not customary to marry off the younger daughter before the elder. Jacob, in his love for Rachel, agreed to work another 7 years to marry her as well. Thus, in his household, there were 2 sisters, each beloved in their own way, and Jacob's heart was torn between them. From this union, the foundations of the 12 tribes of Israel were laid. Leah, though not the first choice of Jacob's heart, bore him 6 sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. Through her eyes, Jacob saw a love that blossomed from the very depths of the earth, as Leah yearned for the affection her husband never gave her. In her sorrow, she found a voice, and with each son born, she named them to reflect her hope, her pain, and her longing. Rachel, though barren for many years, was not without her own influence. She had a maidservant, Bilhah, whom she gave to Jacob to bear children on her behalf. Bilhah gave birth to Dan and Naphtali, and Rachel's desperation for a child seemed to find a temporary answer in her servant's womb. But then God opened Rachel's own womb, and she bore Jacob's youngest son, Joseph, the child of her great love. Her joy was overwhelming, for she had finally given Jacob the son of his deepest desire. As the years passed, more children were born to Jacob's other wives, and though the rivalry between Leah and Rachel was bitter, it gave birth to the 12 tribes. Each son would later become the patriarch of a tribe, and together they would form the foundation of a nation that would carry the promises of God. The covenant passed from Abraham to Isaac and now to Jacob. But for Jacob, it was a journey of not just fatherhood, but of wrestling with his own nature, his own identity, and the will of the God who had watched over him since his vision of the ladder. Through the bonds of family, the 12 tribes would emerge, each with their own legacy, their own trials, but all bound together in the promise that God had made to Jacob, the one who would become Israel. After many years of hardship, labor, and personal struggle, Jacob prepared to return to the land of Canaan, the land promised to his forefathers. He had spent over 20 years in Haran, building his family, his wealth, and his legacy. But now, the time had come to fulfill the command of God. In his heart, Jacob knew that it was time to face the past and reconcile with the land and the promise that had been given to him, the promise that his grandfather Abraham had received and his father Isaac had inherited. He could no longer remain in the land of his exile. God had spoken to Jacob in a dream, calling him to return to Canaan. The journey ahead was not just a physical one, but a spiritual one, filled with the weight of past decisions, deceit, and the fear of meeting his brother Esau, whom he had wronged many years before. But despite the fear and doubt that clouded his heart, Jacob gathered his wives, his children, and his flocks, and began the long journey back to the land of his ancestors. As Jacob journeyed, he was keenly aware of the tension that lingered between him and Esau. The last time they had met, Jacob had fled, having stolen the birthright and blessing that rightly belonged to his elder brother. Esau, enraged by the betrayal, had vowed to kill Jacob. Jacob had left under the cover of night, escaping with only what he could carry. Now, as he drew closer to Canaan, the thought of meeting Esau again weighed heavily upon him. Would Esau still be angry? Would he seek revenge for the wrongs of the past? Jacob sent messengers ahead to his brother, bearing gifts and humble words of peace, seeking reconciliation. His heart was filled with trepidation as he awaited their return. The messengers came back with troubling news. Esau was coming to meet him, and with him, 400 men. Jacob's heart sank, fearing the worst. He divided his family into 2 groups, hoping that if Esau attacked one, the other might escape. He offered gifts of flocks and herds, praying that they might soften Esau's heart. In the stillness of the night, alone and filled with fear, Jacob wrestled with his own thoughts and with God. He did not sleep, but fought with a mysterious man who came to him in the darkness, a divine being whose touch caused his hip to be dislocated. In that struggle, Jacob clung to the figure, refusing to let go until he was blessed. It was there, in that wrestling match, that Jacob's name was changed to Israel, meaning one who struggles with God, or God prevails. His covenant with God was reaffirmed, and with the new day, Jacob arose, transformed. The next morning, Jacob and Esau met, but to his surprise, Esau embraced him, weeping and forgiving the wrongs of the past. The gifts were accepted, but it was the reconciliation that touched Jacob's soul. The land of Canaan, once a place of fear and uncertainty, now became a place of promise, where the covenant would be fulfilled. Jacob's return was not just the return to a physical home, but to a renewed relationship with God, with his brother, and with his own identity. The journey, fraught with trials, had brought him to the place of peace and divine promise. Jacob's sons had grown, and their lives had begun to take their own course, but there was one among them whose destiny would set him apart from the rest. Joseph, the firstborn of Rachel, was a child of beauty and favor, loved by his father more than all of his brothers. This love, however, became a source of division and jealousy. Jacob, recognizing Joseph's potential, had given him a coat of many colors, a symbol of his father's unique affection. But this gesture of love, though well-intentioned, was a thorn to his other sons, who harbored resentment toward the favored child. The tension reached its peak when Joseph, already the dreamer, shared with his brothers a vision he had received from God. He dreamed of a time when his brothers would bow down before him, a moment that stirred anger in their hearts. "Shall you indeed reign over us?" they scoffed. The dream, a divine message, only deepened their envy, for they could not bear the thought of Joseph rising above them. In their hearts, they plotted. One fateful day, when Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers who were tending their flocks far from home, they saw him coming from a distance. His brightly colored coat made him an easy target, and as they saw him approach, their hatred surged. "Here comes the dreamer," they mocked among themselves. It was then that they decided to seize the moment, to rid themselves of the brother they had come to loathe. They seized Joseph, tearing off his coat and throwing him into a deep pit. The world around him grew dark as the brothers sat down to eat, leaving Joseph trapped, helpless, and alone. Their plan, however, had yet to fully unfold. As they ate, a caravan of Ishmaelite traders passed by, bound for Egypt. At this moment, Judah, one of the brothers, proposed a solution that would rid them of Joseph without his blood being on their hands. "What profit is there if we kill him?" he reasoned. Instead, they decided to sell him as a slave, sending him to a foreign land. The brothers, without remorse, dipped Joseph's coat in goat's blood and returned to their father with a story of his death. Jacob, upon seeing the coat, believed the lie and mourned deeply, his heart broken by the supposed loss of his beloved son. Meanwhile, Joseph, far from home, was bound in chains, his future uncertain, his dreams a distant whisper in the chaos of his newfound reality. Thus, the seeds of suffering had been sown, and though Joseph's journey seemed bleak, it was through this very hardship that God's divine plan would unfold, shaping the destiny of a family and a nation. The brothers thought they had crushed Joseph's dreams, but in truth, they were setting the stage for their own eventual redemption. Joseph's journey took him far from the familiar hills of Canaan, now a distant memory. He was bound in chains and led across the desert to Egypt, a land of vast unknowns. The shock of being betrayed by his brothers, of being sold as a slave, settled heavily in his heart. But as the days turned to weeks, he found himself learning to survive in a world he never imagined. The people of Egypt spoke a language he did not understand, and their ways were foreign to him. Yet in the midst of his suffering, Joseph's character remained steadfast, his trust in God unwavering, even when the world seemed to turn its back on him. When Joseph arrived in Egypt, he was sold to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. Potiphar was a man of influence, and his house became the place where Joseph would find an unexpected opportunity to rise. In the early days of his servitude, Joseph could have allowed despair to consume him. He could have become bitter, letting the darkness of his situation shape his soul. But Joseph chose a different path. He worked diligently, and his integrity shone through. Potiphar, seeing his servant's skill and devotion, placed him in charge of his household, entrusting him with responsibility and the care of all his affairs. The Lord was with Joseph, and his success did not go unnoticed. Everything Joseph touched seemed to flourish. But even in the midst of favor, temptation lurked. Potiphar's wife, seeing Joseph's handsome face and strength, began to desire him. She made advances, attempting to seduce him, but Joseph, ever faithful to his God and his master, refused her. "How then could I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" he asked, his voice steady and filled with conviction. But her advances grew bolder, and one day, when no one was around, she grabbed his garment, pleading with him to lie with her. Joseph fled, leaving his cloak behind, but her anger was swift. In her fury, she accused him of trying to assault her, and Potiphar, believing his wife's lies, had Joseph thrown into prison. Once again, Joseph found himself in a place of despair, but his integrity remained intact. Even in prison, Joseph did not turn his back on the wisdom and favor of the Lord. He was soon put in charge of the prisoners, overseeing their welfare. His gifts of wisdom and leadership continued to shine, and once again, his trust in God was evident. Joseph's path was long and difficult, but in the darkest places, he never let go of his faith, knowing that the Lord was with him. Through his pain and hardship, he learned that even in the most painful seasons, God was shaping his future for something far greater than he could imagine. Years passed, and the famine that had plagued the land of Canaan grew more severe, devastating the crops and bringing suffering to all who lived there. Jacob, now older, faced the grim reality that his family might not survive without food. Word came to him from distant lands that Egypt had grain to sell, and so, with heavy hearts, he sent his sons to seek sustenance from the land that had once seemed so foreign and distant to them. But Joseph, whom they had sold into slavery, was now at the heart of that foreign kingdom, though they did not know it. As the brothers made their way toward Egypt, memories of their betrayal haunted them. They did not speak of it, but the weight of what they had done to Joseph, their youngest brother, the one they had once envied and hated, lingered in the back of their minds. When they arrived in Egypt, they stood before the man in charge of the grain, not recognizing the ruler before them. Joseph, though, saw them immediately. His heart twisted in sorrow and confusion, but there was also a great sense of justice that rose within him. His brothers were before him, but they were unaware of who he truly was. Joseph's mind raced with thoughts of revenge, but his spirit knew a different path was before him. He had become a man of Egypt, not the boy who had been sold so long ago. With a quiet strength, he observed his brothers, seeing not just their faces, but the guilt and sorrow hidden deep within them. They spoke of their father, Jacob, of their youngest brother, Benjamin, and how they had been marked by the choices they had made. In that moment, Joseph understood that his journey filled with pain, betrayal, and suffering had not been for nothing. It had been a path that led him to this very moment, to this reunion. He had forgiven them in his heart long ago, but now the time had come for them to understand their actions and face the truth of what they had done. Joseph chose not to reveal himself at once. Instead, he tested them. He accused them of being spies, and he kept Simeon as a prisoner, sending them back to Canaan with a command to bring Benjamin to Egypt. His heart ached as he watched them leave, but he knew that this was part of the plan. It was the only way to truly reconcile with them. He wanted them to see the truth of their hearts, to know the full weight of their past decisions. Back in Canaan, Jacob was reluctant to send Benjamin, the last of Rachel's children, into a land that had already taken one son from him. But the famine pressed hard, and finally, he agreed. The family, though reluctant, set forth once again, unaware that the long-lost Joseph awaited them in Egypt. The reunion, when it came, would be one of tears, forgiveness, and the unfolding of a divine plan that none of them could have foreseen. As Jacob grew old and his days on earth grew shorter, he called his sons to his side. The time had come for him to pass on not just his wealth, but his blessings, prophecies that would shape the future of their descendants. One by one, his sons gathered around his bed, each of them marked by their own experiences, strengths, and faults. With each son, Jacob spoke, his voice steady but filled with the weight of years lived and lessons learned. Reuben, his firstborn, stood before him. Jacob's words were not filled with praise, for Reuben had faltered in his youth, his strength marred by his sin. Yet Jacob spoke of his great potential, though he was not destined for leadership. "You are my firstborn, the beginning of my strength, but you will not excel," Jacob prophesied. The weight of this blessing carried with it both a reminder of what had been lost and a hint of what could have been. Next came Simeon and Levi, who had once acted with violence, their hands stained with the blood of the Shechemites. Jacob's words were full of sorrow, yet he did not condemn them utterly. "Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel." But he spoke also of the tribe of Levi, destined to serve in the house of God. Though their actions had brought them low, the future would redeem them through service and devotion. Judah stood before his father next, and his blessing was far different. Jacob's voice softened as he spoke of Judah's greatness, the lion-like strength that would come to define his line. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. Judah's descendants, the kings of Israel, would come from his line. It was a prophecy that echoed through generations, the promise of a king greater than any who had come before him, the future King David and the Messiah. Then came Zebulun, Issachar, Dan, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Joseph, and Benjamin, each receiving a blessing tailored to their character and fate. To Joseph, the most beloved, Jacob offered words of immense promise. He spoke of Joseph's strength, his resilience through hardship, and the blessings that would overflow from his line. Joseph is a fruitful bough, whose branches run over the wall. Jacob foresaw that his son's descendants would be numerous and blessed, their influence spreading far and wide. Finally, to Benjamin, the youngest, Jacob spoke of a tribe that would be fierce in battle, a tribe whose warriors would rise to defend the nation. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf, in the morning devouring the prey and at night dividing the spoil. As Jacob finished his blessings, he called for the sons to bury him in the cave of Machpelah, where his ancestors lay. His final words were a promise and a prayer, echoing through the generations. The blessings were now spoken, and the tribes of Israel would carry their father's words into the future, fulfilling his prophecies in their own time. Jacob breathed his last, his soul now at rest, but his legacy lived on in the 12 tribes, each carrying the weight of his words, the promise of their future, and the hope of redemption. Jacob's life, though long, had reached its final chapter. As his days drew to a close, the patriarch of Israel knew that the time had come for him to join his ancestors. His strength waned, his body weary from the trials of a lifetime. Yet even in his old age, Jacob's spirit remained resolute, his faith unwavering. He called for his sons to gather around him, to witness the end of his journey and the fulfillment of his promises. The room was quiet, the weight of his words and the presence of his family filling the air. Jacob's heart was at peace, for he had lived to see his family flourish, his descendants poised to inherit the land promised to his grandfather Abraham and his father Isaac. And though he knew the end was near, he also knew that his covenant with God would remain intact, passed down through his children. His final breaths were slow and labored, but Jacob's faith never faltered. He spoke of the land where he wished to be buried, the cave of Machpelah in Canaan, the resting place of Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and his beloved Leah. It was there that he wished his body to rest, a final connection to the promises of God and the legacy of his forefathers. As his sons made preparations for his burial, Jacob's spirit began to fade, and he whispered his final words of blessing over his sons. His sons mourned deeply, for Jacob had been their father, their guide, and their protector. Each of them had known his love, his wisdom, and his leadership, and now they were left with the heavy responsibility of carrying on his legacy. The grief was palpable, but there was also a sense of reverence. For Jacob's death was not just the end of a man's life, it marked the passing of a generation, the closing of an era, and the beginning of a new chapter for Israel. Jacob's body was carefully prepared for burial, anointed with oils and wrapped in fine linen. His sons, led by Joseph, carried his body from Egypt to Canaan, a journey fraught with both sorrow and honor. Along the way, they stopped at the threshing floor of Atop, where they held a great mourning. The Egyptians who accompanied them were struck by the depth of the family's grief, for they saw that the mourning for Jacob was not just that of a father's death, but the loss of a patriarch, the end of a covenantal era. When they finally arrived in Canaan, the mourners made their way to the cave of Machpelah, the resting place of the great patriarchs. There, Jacob was laid to rest beside his beloved Leah. His body returned to the earth from which it had come. His sons, now leaders of their own families and tribes, stood in silence, their hearts heavy with loss but also filled with the understanding of the weight of the promises they carried. And so, Jacob was buried. His life, his blessings, and his legacy lived on in his descendants. Though he had left this world, His story continued to unfold in the lives of the tribes of Israel, who would go on to inherit the land promised to their forefathers. And as the winds whispered through the trees of Canaan, it was as if the earth itself mourned the loss of the father of Israel, a son of Abraham, who had walked with God and seen the fulfillment of promises made long ago. Joseph's life had spanned many years, marked by trials and triumphs, and now, as he lay upon his deathbed, the weight of his legacy pressed upon him. The family he had once ruled over, a collection of brothers who had once betrayed him, had now become the tribes of Israel, scattered across the land of Egypt. His journey, once filled with hardship and uncertainty, had led him to this moment of peace. He had forgiven, he had redeemed, and he had been a faithful servant of the Lord, guiding his family through famine, through prosperity, and through the difficult years that followed. As Joseph felt the approach of death, his thoughts turned to the promises made to his forefathers. God had sworn an oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, a promise that was passed down to him. He knew that the covenant would continue, but not in Egypt. Egypt was a land of refuge for now, but it was not the inheritance that had been promised to them. The land of Canaan was their true home. Joseph called for his brothers to gather around him. One last time, they stood by his side, each man bearing the weight of his love, his forgiveness, and his final instructions. In a voice now growing faint, Joseph spoke of the future, a time when God would lead them out of Egypt. He promised them that they would one day return to the land of Canaan, to the place where their ancestors had lived, and where the promises of God would be fulfilled. His words were not just those of a dying man, but a prophetic vision, a hope for the future. He made them swear an oath that when God delivered them from their captivity, they would carry his bones with them and lay him to rest in the land of their forefathers. With these words, Joseph passed from this world. His family mourned deeply, for Joseph had been their protector, their sustainer, and their brother. His wisdom had brought them through the years of famine. His faith had brought them closer to God, and his forgiveness had healed the wounds of the past. But even in their mourning, there was a sense of hope, for Joseph had spoken of a future that would be bright and full of promise. When the time came, Joseph's body was embalmed according to Egyptian custom and placed in a coffin in Egypt. It would remain there for many years, a reminder of the man who had risen from the depths of despair to become a ruler in Egypt, a savior for his people. But as the years passed and the promise of deliverance loomed on the horizon, Joseph's bones would eventually be carried to the land promised to his ancestors, fulfilling his last request. Joseph's death marked the end of an era, but it was also the beginning of a new chapter. His promise of return, his faith in God's covenant, would continue to echo in the hearts of the Israelites as they waited for the day when they would leave Egypt and enter the land flowing with milk and honey. Until that day, they would carry with them the memory of Joseph and the promise of God's faithfulness. Over time, the family of Israel, once a small group of people, began to grow in Egypt. What had started as a refuge for Jacob and his sons during a time of famine turned into a large community, expanding and thriving within the land. Their numbers swelled, and as the years passed, they became a people unto themselves, distinct in their culture, their faith, and their customs. Yet, despite their growing prosperity, the shadow of change began to loom over them. The memory of Joseph, the great leader who had saved Egypt from famine, faded with each passing generation, and the new Pharaoh, who did not know Joseph, saw the swelling population of Israel not as a blessing, but as a threat. At first, the Egyptians welcomed the Israelites, allowing them to settle in the land of Goshen, where they could raise their families and tend to their herds. They lived as guests, their presence a reminder of the time when their forefather Joseph had been a great and respected man in Egypt. But as the Israelites multiplied, the Egyptians began to grow wary. The Pharaoh, gripped by fear, saw their numbers as a potential rebellion waiting to happen. He feared that in time, the Israelites would become too powerful and would join Egypt's enemies in battle, turning the tide against the kingdom. In a desperate attempt to control the growing threat, the Pharaoh issued a decree. The Israelites, who had once been treated with kindness, now found themselves enslaved, forced into hard labor to build Egypt's cities and monuments. The very people who had been welcomed as guests were now reduced to mere tools in the hands of their oppressors. The dream of a peaceful existence in Egypt was shattered, replaced by the cruel reality of slavery. The Egyptians used the strength of the Israelites to serve their own needs, forcing them to work relentlessly, day after day, under the harshest conditions. They were made to build supply cities, to work in the fields, and to serve in any way that benefited the empire, all the while under the watchful eye of the Egyptian taskmasters. Despite the oppression, the Israelites continued to multiply. Their faith remained steadfast, and their hope for deliverance burned within them, even as their cries for mercy went unheard. As the years turned into decades, the memory of their former glory began to fade. But even in their suffering, the people of Israel held on to a promise that had been passed down from generation to generation. They knew that God had not forgotten them, that He had promised to make them a great nation, and that one day He would deliver them from bondage. And so, as the Israelites labored under the heavy burden of slavery, their faith remained their strength, and they clung to the hope that God would fulfill His promise. Little did they know, the time of their deliverance was fast approaching, and the path to freedom would lead them toward an even greater journey. In the midst of Israel's enslavement, a child was born in the land of Goshen, destined to be the one who would lead his people to freedom. His parents, Amram and Jochebed, were from the tribe of Levi, and their son was born into a world that had become increasingly hostile. The Pharaoh's command had been clear and cruel. Every male Israelite born was to be cast into the Nile, a decree that was meant to curb the growing population of the Israelites. But this child, whom they named Moses, would not be part of that plan. From the moment of his birth, there was something extraordinary about Moses. His mother, recognizing the significance of her son, hid him for 3 months, keeping him safe from the watchful eyes of the Egyptians. But as the child grew, it became impossible to conceal him any longer. The Pharaoh's men would surely find him. And so, with a heavy heart, Jochebed made a decision that would change the course of history. She placed her son in a basket made of papyrus and set him afloat on the Nile River, praying that God would protect him from the dangers of the water and the cruelty of the Egyptians. The basket drifted down the river, and it was by divine providence that it came to rest near the place where Pharaoh's daughter came to bathe. The princess, seeing the basket and hearing the cries of the infant, took pity on him. She knew that this child was one of the Hebrew babies, but her heart was moved by his helplessness. Without hesitation, she decided to adopt him as her own. In this act of compassion, she defied her father's decree, and in doing so, became a key instrument in the unfolding of God's plan for Israel. Moses' sister, Miriam, who had watched from a distance, approached the princess and offered to find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child. It was then that Jochebed, Moses' own mother, was called upon to care for her son. In this way, Moses was able to grow in his early years under the protection and care of his own family, even as he was raised in the house of Pharaoh. As Moses grew, he was torn between 2 worlds, the life of privilege in the Egyptian palace and his true identity as a Hebrew. But God's hand was upon him, guiding him toward the purpose for which he had been born. He was destined to be the deliverer of Israel, the one who would stand before Pharaoh and demand the release of God's people. But before he could rise to that calling, he would first have to come to terms with his identity, his faith, and the God who had protected him from birth. Moses' life took a drastic turn one fateful day when he saw an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave. The cruelty of the act stirred something deep within him, and in a moment of impassioned rage, Moses struck down the Egyptian, hiding his body in the sand. He knew that he had committed a grave act, but the weight of the injustice he had witnessed drove him to it. The next day, when Moses tried to intervene between 2 Hebrews who were quarreling, one of them asked, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you going to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" The words struck Moses with the realization that his act of violence had been discovered, and Pharaoh, hearing of it, sought to have him executed. In a moment of fear and self-preservation, Moses fled from Egypt, leaving behind the life of privilege he had known in Pharaoh's palace. Moses journeyed to the land of Midian, a desolate desert region far from Egypt, a place where he could escape the wrath of Pharaoh. He came to a well, where he encountered the 7 daughters of the priest of Midian, who had come to draw water for their father's flocks. When some shepherds attempted to drive them away, Moses stood up for them, helping to water their sheep. The girls returned to their father, Reuel, and told him of the Egyptian who had helped them. Reuel invited Moses to stay with them, and Moses, now a stranger in a foreign land, accepted. In Midian, Moses found a new life, far removed from the riches and responsibilities of his past. He married Zipporah, the daughter of Reuel, and became a shepherd, leading flocks across the dry hills of Midian. His life of comfort and power was replaced by the humble existence of tending to sheep, a far cry from the throne he had once known. For many years, Moses lived in this solitude, away from the world that had once been his. He learned the ways of the desert, finding peace in the quiet vastness of the wilderness. But as he wandered the hills with his flocks, Moses had no way of knowing that his time of preparation was not over. He was being shaped in ways he could not yet comprehend. His humility tested, his faith deepened. The pride and power that had once characterized his life in Egypt were replaced with patience, resilience, and an awareness of his dependence on God. Moses had been a prince in Egypt, but now he was a shepherd, a man who would one day lead the flock of Israel through the wilderness. In the desert, Moses was forgotten by the world, but he was not forgotten by God. The quiet years in Midian would become the foundation for his calling, the shaping of a man who would one day stand before Pharaoh and demand the freedom of God's people. The wilderness was not a place of exile for Moses, but a place of preparation for the great task that lay ahead. Moses had lived in Midian for many years, content in his role as a shepherd, far removed from the life he had once known in Egypt. The quiet solitude of the desert had become his home, and in the stillness of the wilderness, he had learned to listen to the whispers of the wind, the crackle of fire, and the calls of the creatures that roamed the land. It was here, in the midst of his daily routine, that something extraordinary occurred. As Moses led his flock to the mountain of God, Horeb, he came upon a strange sight: a bush that was on fire but was not consumed. The flames licked at the branches, yet the bush remained unscathed, its leaves still green, its form untouched. Moses, curious and captivated, approached the burning bush, his heart filled with wonder and confusion. He had seen many things in his time in the wilderness, but never something like this. And then, a voice broke through the silence, calling his name, "Moses, Moses." The voice was deep and powerful, yet carried a tenderness that stirred something within him. He replied instinctively, "Here I am." The voice continued, commanding him to take off his sandals, for the ground on which he stood was holy. As Moses obeyed, trembling in awe, the voice revealed its identity. "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Moses hid his face, overwhelmed by the weight of the divine presence before him. He knew this was no ordinary encounter. It was the God of his ancestors, the God who had spoken to the patriarchs, now speaking to him. The voice then spoke of the suffering of the Israelites in Egypt, of their cries for deliverance, and how God had heard their plea. "I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey." Moses listened, stunned, as the purpose of his calling was slowly revealed. And then the voice turned to him, saying, "So now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people the Israelites out of Egypt." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of destiny. Moses, filled with doubt and uncertainty, hesitated. "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" he asked, unsure of his ability to fulfill such a task. But the voice reassured him, saying, "I will be with you." It was a promise, a divine assurance that Moses would not face this mission alone. The voice told Moses that he would lead the people to the very mountain where he now stood, and there they would worship God. This was not just a mission, it was a covenanta divine promise that would unfold through Moses' obedience. As Moses stood before the burning bush, the call that had been placed on his life became clear. No longer would he be a humble shepherd. He was being chosen for a purpose far greater than he could have imagined, and the God who had spoken to the patriarchs now called him to lead his people out of bondage. The fire in the bush burned brightly, and in it, Moses saw not just a sign but a divine mandatia calling that would change the course of history. Moses stood at the edge of the wilderness, looking back at the land that had become his home for so many years. The call of God had been clear, yet now, as he prepared to return to Egypt, doubt crept into his heart. He had fled that land in fear, leaving behind a life of power and privilege. The very thought of returning to Pharaoh, the king who had once sought his life, stirred unease deep within him. How could a simple shepherd, with no army or power, challenge the ruler of Egypt? How could he, a man of no great speech, stand before Pharaoh and demand the release of the Israelites? But the voice of God had spoken with authority, commanding him to go. The weight of the divine promise hung over him like a mantle, and he knew that he was not walking this path alone. God had promised to be with him, to guide him through every challenge, and to perform wonders that would make Pharaoh relent. And so, with the staff of God in hand and the burning resolve of his calling, Moses began his journey back to the land of Egypt. As he arrived in Egypt, the city felt different. The air seemed thicker with the weight of the years that had passed, but the cries of the Israelites, still echoing in his mind, stirred his resolve. He had come to fulfill a purpose much greater than himself. Moses sought out his brother Aaron, whom God had appointed to speak on his behalf. Together, they approached the leaders of Israel, delivering the words that would begin the great deliverance. "The God of your ancestors has sent me to you," Moses declared, "and he has heard your cries. He will bring you out of the land of Egypt and deliver you to a land flowing with milk and honey." The elders of Israel, long oppressed and burdened, received Moses and Aaron's words with joy and faith. They believed that God had not forgotten them, and they saw in Moses the messenger of their deliverance. But their faith would soon be tested. With Aaron at his side, Moses stood before Pharaoh. The mighty king, sitting in his palace, regarded Moses with disdain. "Who is this God that I should listen to him?" Pharaoh sneered. "I do not know the God of Israel, and I will not let Israel go." The refusal was not a surprise, but the hardness of Pharaoh's heart was a challenge Moses had been prepared for. He was not to be deterred. Moses, with Aaron's voice speaking the words given to him by God, declared the first demand: "Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." Pharaoh, angered by the audacity of the request, responded with fury. He increased the Israelites' labor, demanding even more from them than before, showing no mercy. Moses, though shaken by Pharaoh's response, knew this was only the beginning. God had said he would not let Pharaoh's heart be softened easily. He had come not just to speak words, but to challenge the powers of Egypt and to deliver his people from bondage. Moses was ready for what lay ahead, for the journey had only just begun, and the showdown between divine will and human pride would unfold with each passing moment. The air in Egypt grew thick with tension, the people murmuring in disbelief as Moses and Aaron continued their bold confrontation with Pharaoh. With each passing day, the king's heart seemed to grow harder, defiant in his refusal to release the Israelites. His power, though vast, was no match for the will of God, and the divine hand that had brought Moses back to Egypt now moved with unrelenting force. Moses stood before Pharaoh once more, a solemn warning in his eyes. "This is what the Lord says: let my people go, or else." Pharaoh, emboldened by his wealth and might, scoffed at the threat. He saw no reason to heed the words of a shepherd and his brother, despite the strange signs and wonders that had followed them. The Nile continued to flow as always. The sun shone in its accustomed brilliance, and Egypt seemed untouched by the threat of destruction. But God was not a God to be mocked, and the first plague was unleashed. The river, once a symbol of life, was transformed into blood. The waters that flowed through the great Nile turned red, foul, and undrinkable. Fish died, and the land began to stink with decay. The people cried out in horror, and Pharaoh, though troubled, hardened his heart. He called upon his magicians to replicate the miracle, and they succeeded in doing so, though in doing so, they only made the devastation worse. But Pharaoh was unmoved. His response was clear: he would not release the Israelites. So God brought forth a second plague, the frogs. The earth was soon covered in the creatures, their croaks deafening, their slimy bodies invading every home and every corner of Egypt. They swarmed over the land, their presence overwhelming and repulsive. Again, Pharaoh pleaded for relief, and Moses, at God's command, interceded on his behalf. The frogs were driven out, but once again, Pharaoh's heart turned cold. He would not relent. The plagues continued, one after another. Gnats that swarmed like a living cloud, flies that brought disease and ruin, and the cattle that fell sick and died. A blow to Egypt's prosperity. Each plague was a demonstration of God's power, each one a direct challenge to the gods of Egypt. But Pharaoh, seeing no immediate harm to his throne, continued in his pride and stubbornness. The suffering of the land grew with every plague, yet with each turn of the heart, Pharaoh's resistance only made God's judgment more certain. Moses and Aaron's pleas grew more urgent, their warning more dire. The plagues were not just an attack on Pharaoh's pride, but a call to repentance, a plea for Egypt to turn back from its cruelty. Still, Pharaoh resisted, each plague falling like a hammer on the heart of a king who refused to acknowledge the truth that was laid before him. As the days turned into weeks, it became ever clearer that the weight of Egypt's sin had grown too great to ignore. The people, once proud and untouchable, now saw the force of God's judgment bearing down on them, but it was Pharaoh's hardened heart that kept the storm of judgment from ending. The plagues were far from over, and Egypt's suffering would grow even more intense. God's hand was moving, and Egypt would soon know the full cost of their rebellion. The night air in Egypt was thick with anticipation, the moon casting a pale light over the land as the final plague approached. The cries of the people echoed from the homes of the Egyptians, their hearts gripped by fear and uncertainty. Pharaoh's heart had hardened to the last, and yet the hand of God remained unwavering in its purpose. It was the moment Moses had long foreseen, the culmination of divine judgment and mercy. The blood of the Lamb would mark the threshold of a new beginning for Israel, and the journey out of bondage would soon commence. In every Israelite home, the lamb was slaughtered, its blood smeared on the doorposts and lintels. The bitter herbs, the unleavened bread, the fire, every detail meticulously followed, for this was the sign of their redemption. In the stillness of the night, God's promise was about to unfold. As the angel of death passed through Egypt, the firstborn of every Egyptian household, from the highest throne to the lowest servant, fell to the ground in sorrow. The sound of mourning filled the land, the grief of a nation reverberating through the streets. But in the homes of the Israelites, there was no death, no mourning. The blood of the Lamb, a symbol of divine protection, shielded them from the judgment that had befallen Egypt. The Lord's word had been kept, and his people were spared. This was the final act that would break Pharaoh's will. And as dawn broke over the land, Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron in a fury of desperation. "Rise up, go out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel. Go, serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds, as you have requested, and be gone." The Israelites, their hearts filled with both awe and relief, gathered their belongings, their possessions, their families. The air, once heavy with the tension of bondage, was now filled with the lightness of liberation. The land of Egypt had been a place of suffering, a place of oppression. But now, the people of Israel would walk in freedom, and the journey to the promised land would begin. Moses, guided by the Lord, led the people with confidence. The cloud of God's presence went before them by day, and the fire by night, showing them the way. As they left Egypt, they carried with them the weight of their history, the pain of slavery, but also the promise of a future unknown and full of hope. The Exodus had begun, and though the road ahead would be long, they were free. The blood of the Lamb had marked their deliverance, and as they stepped into the unknown, the faith of Israel stood firm, for God had delivered them from the hand of the oppressor. The Israelites stood at the edge of the sea, their eyes wide with both awe and fear. Behind them, the land of Egypt stretched out, now a memory of their bondage. But the sound of Pharaoh's chariots growing louder with each passing moment reminded them of their relentless pursuer. The sea before them was vast and impassable, its waters stretching farther than the eye could see. Yet, the divine presence that had led them from Egypt stood with them, hovering like a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. Their path had been blocked by the very thing they had no power to overcome, the mighty Red Sea. The cries of the people grew louder, their hearts heavy with despair. "Why have you brought us here to die?" they asked Moses. "Were there not enough graves in Egypt that you had to bring us into the wilderness?" But Moses, undeterred by their fear, stood firm, his eyes lifted to the skies. He had known that this moment would come, that God's deliverance would not be a simple journey, but one that required trust in the unseen. With a voice that resonated with the strength of God's promise, Moses responded, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again." As the murmurs of uncertainty swirled among the Israelites, the Lord spoke to Moses. "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the waters so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground." With the faith of a leader guided by divine power, Moses obeyed, his staff raised high. The wind, as if responding to the command of the Almighty, began to blow with great force, separating the waters of the sea, creating a dry path through the midst of the deep. The waters stood like walls to their left and right, a miracle unfolding before their very eyes. The Israelites, hesitating at first, began to march forward, their feet sinking into the dry earth beneath them as they walked through the heart of the sea. The thunderous roar of the parted waters echoed in their ears. Yet there was no fear, only the unshakable feeling of divine protection that enveloped them. Each step forward was a step away from the terror of Egypt, into the promise of freedom. Pharaoh's army, relentless in their pursuit, followed with all their might, their chariots thundering across the desert as they too entered the dry path between the waters. But as the last of the Israelites reached the other side, the Lord's power moved once more. The waters, held back by divine command, began to collapse. In an instant, the sea returned to its natural state, engulfing the Egyptian army. The cries of terror were silenced as the waters closed over them, the chariots and horses lost to the depths. The Israelites, now safe on the other side, stood in awe. Their deliverance had been wrought not by their own strength, but through the overwhelming power of God. The path through the sea was not just a physical crossing, it was a spiritual transformation, a moment when they were made free by the divine hand that had parted the waters. Their journey had begun with fear, but now, as they looked back at the wreckage of Egypt's army, their faith had been solidified. They were free, they were saved, and the Lord had delivered them in a way they would never forget. The Israelites stood at the foot of Mount Sinai, a vast and rugged peak towering before them. The air was thick with anticipation, and the mountain seemed to pulse with a power that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. For 3 days, they had prepared themselves, cleansing their bodies and hearts in anticipation of the moment when they would receive the words of the Almighty. Moses, their leader, had ascended the mountain, leaving the people below, waiting for the divine encounter that would shape their destiny. As the 3rd day dawned, a great thunderstorm enveloped the mountain, with lightning flashing across the sky and thunder rumbling like the voice of God. The earth trembled, and a thick cloud of smoke descended upon the peak, enveloping it in darkness. The Israelites stood in reverent silence, for they knew that the presence of the Lord was about to descend upon the mountain, and they dared not move or speak. At the top of the mountain, Moses entered the cloud. Standing before the Lord, the voice of God spoke, clear and unyielding, shaking the very foundations of the earth. The commandments were given, not as mere words, but as a covenanta binding promise between the Creator and his people. God's law was not just a set of rules, but a way of life, a path to walk in holiness and righteousness. The words would govern their relationships, their worship, their lives as a people set apart for a divine purpose. The people below watched in wonder as the mountain seemed to burn with fire, its peak glowing with a light that could not be comprehended by human eyes. The sound of the Lord's voice thundered, giving forth the commandments that would guide them through the generations. "You shall have no other gods before me," the voice declared. "You shall not make for yourselves an idol." Each command was like a declaration of divine order, a clear statement of what it meant to live in harmony with God and one another. For 40 days and 40 nights, Moses remained on the mountain, receiving the law and the instructions for the tabernacle, the place where God's presence would dwell among his people. During this time, the Israelites below, though filled with awe, began to grow restless. They had seen the power of God, but they had not heard Moses' voice for many days, and in their impatience, they turned away, casting aside the divine instructions and building a golden calf to worship. When Moses descended from the mountain, his face shone with the radiance of God's glory. His heart was heavy as he saw the people worshiping the idol, turning away from the very law they had been given. In anger, Moses threw down the tablets of stone, breaking them in his fury, a symbol of the people's broken covenant. Yet, even in his anger, God's mercy remained. Moses would return to the mountain, and the law would be given again. For God's people were still his, despite their failings. The giving of the law was more than a moment of divine instruction. It was a covenant, a binding promise that the Creator had made with his people. The law was a guide to righteous living, a roadmap to peace and harmony. It set the Israelites apart from the nations around them and established them as a people bound to God by faith, by love, and by obedience. The fire on the mountain was not just a display of power, but a purification that would endure through time. As Moses descended from the mountain, his heart heavy with the weight of the divine law, he received yet another revelation known that would not be inscribed on tablets of stone, but rather passed down through generations as a reminder of God's covenant with his people. It was the Book of Jubilees, a sacred text that would serve as a guide for the righteous, a narrative of the divine plan unfolding throughout history. Though its words were revealed to Moses, it would not be for him alone to carry. The Book of Jubilees would be the testament of Israel's journey, the story of their creation, their fall, and their redemption. This book was not a mere history. It was a living document, a divine record that marked the passage of time, beginning with creation and stretching toward the end of the age. Its pages would recount the story of the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the generations that followed. It would chronicle the rise and fall of nations, the judgment of the unrighteous, and the promise of salvation. It was not just for the people of Moses' time, but for all the righteous generations to come. God revealed to Moses that the events contained in the Book of Jubilees were not just historical occurrences, but divine decrees unfolding according to his will. It spoke of how the world was created in 6 days and how the Sabbath was established, not as a mere day of rest, but as a day of holy remembrance. It outlined the covenant God made with Noah, a covenant that would endure through the ages, and it recounted the faith of Abraham, who trusted in God's promises even when the path seemed uncertain. The book also marked the passing of time in a new way by the cycles of the Jubilee, a period of 50 years. Each cycle was to be a time of renewal, a moment when the people would return to their inheritance, when debts would be forgiven, and when the land would be restored. It was a reflection of God's eternal justice, a reminder that all things were held in his hands, and that even in the midst of trial and tribulation, there was hope for restoration. Through the Book of Jubilees, the people were reminded that they were part of something greater than themselves, part of a divine plan that spanned the ages. It was a book of prophecy, a call to the generations that would come after Moses, urging them to remember their covenant with God, to walk in his ways, and to be a light to the nations. It would serve as a guide for the righteous to follow, a standard by which they could measure their faith and obedience. As Moses transcribed the words of the Book of Jubilees, he felt a deep sense of reverence and awe. This was no ordinary book. It was a record of God's eternal faithfulness to his people, a story that would live on in the hearts of the faithful for generations to come. And as the years passed, the words of the book would continue to shape the lives of those who sought to walk in the light of God's promise, carrying the hope of redemption and the knowledge of his divine plan throughout the ages. In the wilderness, beneath the shadow of Sinai's peaks, the Israelites were not just given the law of God, but were also entrusted with a divine order of time. This was no ordinary calendar, but a celestial reckoning, a sacred rhythm that marked the seasons of life and the unfolding of God's plan for his people. The calendar that was revealed to Moses was not simply a method of counting days, but a spiritual framework, aligning the very cycles of time with the purpose of creation itself. The sacred timekeeping was founded on the structure of the Sabbath, which was set apart as a holy day of rest and renewal. Every seventh day, the people were called to cease their labor and remember the Creator, whose hand had shaped the heavens and the earth in 6 days. It was a day to reflect on the divine order, to give thanks for the gift of life, and to realign their hearts with God's will. But the Sabbath was just the beginning. In God's calendar, there were not only weeks but also months, years, and even jubilee cycles that carried deep spiritual significance. Each year was to begin with the month of Aviv, marking the springtime when life was reborn, and the exodus from Egypt was to be remembered. The Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the Feast of First Fruits were all woven into this new calendar, their timing pointing to God's redemptive work in history. The yearly cycle was punctuated by the sacred festival times of gathering, of feasting, and of remembrance, where the people would come together to honor the acts of salvation that had shaped their nation. But there was more to the divine calendar than just these annual observances. Every 7th year was a sabbatical year, a time for the land to rest, a time when debts were forgiven, and when the Israelites were reminded that the earth itself belonged to God. Then, every 50th year, following 7 cycles of 7, came the year of Jubilee, a time of liberation and restoration. Land that had been sold or lost would be returned to its rightful owner, and those who had fallen into slavery would be set free. It was a divine reset, a declaration that all possessions, all power, and all freedom ultimately belonged to God. Through this calendar, God established a rhythm of life that was meant to draw his people closer to him, reminding them that their existence was intertwined with his divine purpose. Each moment, each season, and each cycle was designed to help the Israelites live in harmony with God's will. It was a way to measure time not by the ticking of hours, but by the rhythm of faith, obedience, and remembrance. In restoring the sacred timekeeping, God was not only creating a means to organize days and years, but was establishing a covenantal pattern. This calendar would guide Israel in its relationship with the Creator and with each other, reminding them that in every season of life, whether in moments of joy or hardship, they were always living under the gaze of the divine, moving closer to the fulfillment of God's promises. The calendar was a living testimony to the ongoing story of salvation, a story that stretched from the beginning of creation to the final restoration of all things. As the Israelites continued their journey through the wilderness, the lessons of Sinai were etched into their hearts and minds. Yet, despite the profound encounters with God and the divine revelations given to Moses, a silent danger loomed over the campone that had long haunted humanity since the days of the first fall. It was the subtle and persistent temptation of idolatry, an urge to exchange the truth of the Creator for the lies of created things. Even as the people had witnessed the mighty hand of God parting the Red Sea and providing manna from heaven, there was still a vulnerability in their hearts, a tendency to look elsewhere for comfort, power, and control. God, knowing the challenges that lay ahead, delivered a stern warning through Moses. He spoke not only of the dangers of false worship, but also of the deep consequences that would befall any who turned their hearts toward idols. The idols that had plagued the nations surrounding them were nothing but empty vessels, images that carried no life or power. To worship them was to embrace the illusion that they could offer what only the Creator could give: life, strength, and deliverance. These false gods, whether in the form of statues, stars, or powers of the earth, were mere distractions from the true source of life and truth. The warning was clear. Israel was called to be a nation set apart, a holy people whose identity was anchored in the covenant that God had established with their forefathers. To turn to idols was not just an act of disobedience, it was a breach of that sacred trust, a rejection of the living God for the dead, lifeless things that could neither speak nor save. God's heart for his people was that they would not be conformed to the ways of the nations, but that they would shine as a beacon of his truth, embodying his holiness and reflecting his glory to the world. In this divine warning, the Israelites were reminded of the lessons from their history. The idolatry of the golden calf at the foot of Sinai had nearly led to their destruction, and the temptation to seek security in false gods had always been present in the hearts of their ancestors. Yet God, in his mercy, had remained faithful, renewing his covenant and offering forgiveness. Now, as they stood on the edge of the promised land, the call was even more urgent. They must remain steadfast in their devotion to the one true God. This warning echoed down through the generations, for even in the land flowing with milk and honey, the temptation of idolatry would persist. The people would face many challenges, from the allure of foreign gods to the pressure to conform to the cultures surrounding them. But the call to hold fast to covenant truth would remain central to their identity, for only in remaining faithful to the God who had delivered them could they live as a people set apart, a people whose lives reflected the eternal truth of the Creator. In this way, Israel was to be a testimony to the nations of the power and majesty of the one true God. As the Israelites continued their journey, God's commandments became the foundation for their lives, offering them a way to live in harmony with the divine order. They were called to be a holy nation, distinct from all others, and the laws given to them were not merely rules to follow, but a reflection of God's own holiness and justice. These laws were designed to govern every aspect of their lives, from their relationships with one another to their worship of the one true God. The laws of purity and justice were woven together, ensuring that the people lived not only in right relationship with God but also with each other. Purity was central to the laws that God gave, as it reflected the need for the people to remain unstained by the corruption of sin. The Israelites were to maintain physical, moral, and spiritual cleanliness, for their relationship with God could not be fully realized if they were tainted by impurity. Purity was not a mere external cleanliness, but a deep internal transformation that aligned the hearts of the people with God's will. Those who came into contact with death, illness, or anything deemed unclean were called to undergo rituals of cleansing before they could fully re-enter the community and worship. This purification process, although seemingly ritualistic, had a profound spiritual meaning. It symbolized the need for the people to be set apart, to be holy as God is holy. Alongside purity, justice was a central aspect of the laws that God laid out. The people were instructed to live in fairness, to treat one another with respect and dignity, and to uphold righteousness in their dealings. The laws ensured that the weak, the poor, the orphan, and the widow were protected, and that no one would be taken advantage of or oppressed. God's justice was not just about punishing wrongdoing, but about ensuring that the people lived in a way that reflected his character. It was a justice that demanded fairness, honesty, and compassion, a justice that called for reconciliation and restoration when relationships were broken. These laws were not just to be observed externally, but were to shape the hearts and minds of the people. They were a means by which the Israelites would reflect God's nature to the world around them. As they followed these laws, they would become a living testimony to the nations of God's holiness and justice. Through their obedience, the people of Israel would show that living according to divine order brought peace, prosperity, and righteousness. Yet, even with such laws in place, the Israelites, like all humanity, would struggle with sin and disobedience. The laws of purity and justice, though perfect in their design, were ultimately a means to reveal the need for redemption. They pointed to the fact that humanity could never fully live up to God's standards on their own. But in the fullness of time, God would send his deliverer, the one who would fulfill these laws perfectly and offer his righteousness to all who would believe. Until then, the laws of purity and justice stood as a reminder of God's call for his people to live in alignment with his will, reflecting his holiness and justice in all that they did. The Sabbath and festivals were not simply rituals for the people of Israel. They were the heartbeat of their relationship with God. In the busy rhythms of daily life, these sacred times served as moments of pause, reflection, and renewal, drawing the people into deeper communion with the Creator. The Sabbath, established at the very foundation of creation, was a sign of God's rest after the work of creation, and it was given to Israel as a gift, a day of rest to refresh the soul and body. For 6 days, the people worked, tending to their fields, caring for their families, and building their lives. But on the 7th day, they were to stop and remember the sanctity of rest, a rest that was not only physical but also spiritual. It was a time to cease striving, to trust in God's provision, and to recognize his sovereignty over all things. The Sabbath was a reminder that time itself was sacred and belonged to God. It was not simply a day off from labor, but a deliberate invitation to step away from the distractions of the world and to reconnect with the divine. As Israel kept the Sabbath, they were reminded that they were God's chosen people, set apart for a holy purpose. It was a day to refresh the body and restore the soul, to quiet the noise of everyday life and listen to the still, small voice of the Creator. In the observance of the Sabbath, the Israelites acknowledged that their worth did not come from their work but from their relationship with God. It was a day that reoriented their hearts and minds, reminding them that they were part of a larger story, one that was defined by God's love, provision, and grace. In addition to the Sabbath, the festivals were woven into the fabric of Israel's sacred time, marking significant moments in the story of God's covenant with his people. The festivals were times of communal joy and celebration, where the people came together to remember and rejoice in the faithfulness of God. Each festival held its own unique significance, but all pointed to the same central truth. God was with his people, providing for them, leading them, and redeeming them. The Passover festival, for example, commemorated Israel's deliverance from slavery in Egypt, a time when God spared the lives of the Israelites through the blood of the Lamb. It was a reminder of God's power to save and his faithfulness to keep his promises. The Feast of Weeks celebrated the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, and the Feast of Tabernacles marked the time when the Israelites lived in temporary shelters during their journey through the wilderness. These festivals were not mere remembrances of past events, but active participations in the story of God's ongoing work in the world. Together, the Sabbath and the festivals formed the heart of sacred time, a rhythm of rest and remembrance that shaped Israel's identity and drew them closer to God. They were times to celebrate his goodness, reflect on his faithfulness, and renew their commitment to live in obedience to his will. These sacred times were designed to shape the hearts of the people, transforming them from a scattered, worldly people into a holy nation that reflected God's character to the world. The future of Israel was marked by both hope and sorrow, as the prophet spoke of a time when the people would face the consequences of their disobedience, yet also experience the joy of their eventual return to the land promised to their forefathers. Israel's history was always intertwined with divine prophecy words spoken by God through his messengers, offering warnings, judgments, and glimpses of restoration. These prophecies painted a picture of a future shaped by the choices of the people, a future that balanced the weight of sin with the promise of redemption. The prophets, from Moses to Isaiah to Jeremiah, forewarned Israel of the consequences of their sin. Their hearts were often hardened, their covenant with God disregarded in favor of idols and self-interest. The prophets spoke of the idolatry and injustice that would lead Israel into exile, a foreign land where they would be oppressed and scattered. The sins of the people, corruption in the courts, exploitation of the poor, and the worship of false gods would not go unpunished. The message was clear. If Israel did not turn back to God, they would face the destruction of their cities and the loss of their inheritance. They would be torn from their land, their homes destroyed, and their temple desecrated. It was a grim future foretold by the prophets, a consequence of Israel's failure to remain faithful. Yet, even in the darkest of prophecies, there was a glimmer of hope, for the prophets also spoke of a day when Israel would be restored. After the exile, there would be a return to the land, a gathering of the scattered people from the four corners of the earth. God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would not be forgotten. Israel's sin would be atoned for, and the people would be purified. The destruction of the temple and the loss of the land would not be the final word. A new day would dawn, when Israel would be reconciled to God, and the sins of the past would be forgiven. The prophets saw a future where Israel would become a light to the nations, a kingdom of priests that would demonstrate God's justice, mercy, and holiness to the world. The return would not be immediate, and it would not come without its trials. Israel would go through the fire of judgment, but they would emerge stronger, more faithful, and more attuned to the voice of God. The promises of restoration were intertwined with the call to repentance, and the people's hearts needed to be softened. God's plans for Israel's future were not just about restoring the land, but about restoring the hearts of the people to Him. In the end, the prophets spoke of a time when God would establish His reign on earth, when His people would know Him as their King, and all would be made right. It was a future of peace, justice, and holiness, a future where Israel would stand as a beacon of God's love and faithfulness, showing the world what it meant to live in covenant with the Creator. The prophecies were not mere predictions, but promises that would be fulfilled, despite Israel's failures, because of the unchanging faithfulness of God. As Jacob neared the end of his life, his thoughts turned to his sons, the 12 tribes of Israel, each of whom would carry his legacy forward. It was time for him to bless them, to speak words of destiny over their lives. Each son, with his unique traits and actions, would play a part in the unfolding story of God's people. Among them, 2 brothers would stand out, Levi and Judah, whose futures would shape the spiritual and political direction of Israel for generations to come. When Jacob came to Levi, the priestly tribe, his words were marked with both rebuke and promise. Levi's descendants, though born into a line of anger and violence, would ultimately be set apart for a higher purpose. Jacob recalled the rage of Levi and Simeon when they avenged the dishonor of their sister Dinah, an act that had brought shame upon their family. Yet, despite their flaws, Levi's descendants would be redeemed, elevated to serve as the priests of Israel. The Levites would carry the sacred duties of the tabernacle and later the temple, mediating between God and His people. They would be the guardians of the law, the keepers of holiness, and the ones who would lead the nation in worship. Jacob's blessing upon Levi foretold of a lineage set apart for service to the Lord, even though their ancestors had once fallen short of God's standard. Through Levi, the priesthood would be established, and it would remain a vital part of Israel's spiritual life. Judah, Jacob's 4th son, received a blessing of a different kind. Judah's line would not be known for the priesthood, but for royalty. Jacob's words over Judah were filled with prophetic promise. He spoke of a ruler who would arise from Judah's descendants, one who would wield authority and reign with justice. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, Jacob declared. This prophecy pointed to the Davidic dynasty, which would come centuries later, and ultimately to the Messiah himself, Jesus Christ, who would be born of Judah's line. Judah's future was marked by leadership, not just among his own tribe, but for the entire nation of Israel. The blessings over Judah were those of power, influence, and a lasting legacy that would extend far beyond Jacob's lifetime. Through Judah, Israel would receive not only a king in David, but the King of Kings in Jesus, the ultimate fulfillment of Jacob's words. As Jacob blessed Levi and Judah, it was clear that these two tribes would play pivotal roles in the unfolding story of Israel. Levi would carry the spiritual responsibility of the nation, while Judah would carry the political and royal authority. Together, these two tribes would represent the heart of God's covenant with Israel, holiness and justice intertwined, each serving its unique purpose in the divine plan. Through them, God's promises to his people would be carried into the future, and his kingdom would come, both in the royal reign of David and in the eternal reign of Christ. As the days of the angel's mission drew to a close, his presence lingered like a silent reminder of the divine truths that had been imparted. His work was almost finished, but his message would echo through the ages, carried by those who had listened and learned. It was now time for the final words, the last utterance of this heavenly messenger who had served as both guide and protector. He stood before the gathered people, his voice steady and filled with the weight of divine authority. In this moment, his call was clear, a call to holiness, a call to remembrance. The people, who had witnessed the angel's power and grace, stood in awe. They had seen him move among them, a beacon of light in the darkest of times, a warrior of righteousness whose actions had turned the course of history. But as the angel prepared to depart, he spoke not of glory or grandeur, but of something far more significant. "Remember," he began, "the holiness of the one who sent me. Keep his commandments and walk in his ways, for this is the path of life." His words were simple, yet profound. Holiness was the call of the hour. It was not a distant ideal, but a living, breathing reality that had to be embraced in every part of life. The angel's message was one of remembrance of God's covenant, of his promises and his faithfulness. "Do not forget the wonders he has shown you," he continued. "Do not forget the ways in which he has delivered you, sustained you, and called you to himself. The road ahead may be fraught with challenges, but do not let the trials cause you to forget who you are and to whom you belong. You are his people, and he is your God." He spoke of the dangers of forgetfulness, warning that a heart that forgets God's works is a heart that strays from his ways. The people had seen the miracles, heard the words of the prophets, and yet the angel knew that human nature was quick to turn away. His words were a plea, a divine urging to keep the memory of God alive in their hearts. Holiness was not a distant concept. It was something to be lived out daily, in every action and every choice. It was a reminder that God's presence was not confined to sacred moments, but was meant to pervade every moment of life. And then, as quickly as he had appeared, the angel's words grew quieter, and his form began to fade, leaving behind only the lingering echo of his call. The people stood still, the weight of his message heavy upon them. The final words of the angel had not been about power or victory, but about the steady, unwavering commitment to holiness and remembrance. As his presence vanished, the people knew that they had been entrusted with something sacred, the responsibility to live as God's people, holy and set apart, remembering always the one who had called them. As Moses stood atop the mountain, the cool winds swirling around him, he felt the weight of the vision that had been entrusted to him. For days, he had been immersed in the glory of the divine presence, his heart full of awe and reverence for the revelations he had received. Yet, even as the heavenly voice still echoed in his mind, there was a deep sense of finality, a quiet certainty that this moment marked the close of the vision and the beginning of something else, the descent back to the people, to the land that awaited them. The mountain had been a place of isolation, of intimacy with the divine, but it was also a place of profound clarity. In the stillness of the moment, Moses understood the immense responsibility that now lay upon his shoulders. The laws had been given, the commandments written, and the covenant sealed. His heart ached with the knowledge that the people below who awaited his return were not yet ready to receive all that had been revealed. Yet, It was not his place to question. His role was to carry the message and lead them, despite their imperfections and their struggles. The fire that had consumed the mountaintop now seemed to flicker in his soul, its warmth still present even though the flames had long since died. Moses closed his eyes and took a deep breath, grounding himself in the sacred truth that had been imparted to him. He knew that his descent would not be the end of his mission, but the beginning of a new phase that would challenge him and the people in ways he could not yet foresee. His heart swelled with both anticipation and a quiet sorrow, for he knew that the path ahead would be long, and the journey would demand more than he had ever given before. The vision had been clear, but its fulfillment would require a life of constant vigilance. Moses had been shown the promises of God, the covenant that was to be established, but he was also shown the trials that would come, the rebellion that would rise, and the struggles that would test the faith of the people. It was a heavy burden, one that he had not fully understood when he first received the call from the burning bush. Now, standing on the mountain, the truth of his calling settled deep within him like the weight of the earth itself. As he began his descent, Moses felt the presence of the Lord one last time, like a silent whisper urging him forward. There was no fanfare, no great display of glory, only the quiet understanding that the time had come for the people to be led, and for him to step into his role as both prophet and shepherd. With each step down, he left the mountaintop behind, but the vision and its truth would remain within him, guiding him through every challenge that lay ahead. As Moses stood before the assembled people, his heart heavy with the weight of all that had been revealed, he knew this moment would define the future of the nation. The covenant, once spoken in whispers, now stood firm before the people of Israel, etched in the tablets of stone. The divine promise that had begun with their forefathers, passed down through the generations, now reached its culmination in the present. It was not just a covenant of laws and commandments, but a promise of relationship, a divine assurance that God would be their God, and they would be his people. The days of wandering had not been without their trials, their doubts, and their struggles. Yet, through it all, the people had been preserved by a grace they had not fully understood. They had seen the miracles, felt the guiding hand of God leading them from bondage to freedom, from uncertainty to promise. Now, standing at the threshold of the land promised to their ancestors, the covenant was sealed once more, and Moses, as God's chosen servant, spoke the final words that would echo across time. "The Lord, your God, is faithful," Moses proclaimed, his voice unwavering. "He has kept his word, and he will keep it forever. You are his chosen people, set apart to be a light to the nations. Walk in his ways, remember his commands, and know that he is with you always." There was a reverence in the air, a stillness that fell over the crowd as the full weight of Moses' words settled into their hearts. The promise of the land, the promise of blessing, but also the promise of responsibility. Israel was to be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, a people set apart not by their own strength, but by the strength of the Lord who had called them. In that moment, Moses understood something deeper than he ever had before. This covenant was not just for Themet, was for all of creation. It was a sign of God's eternal commitment to restore the world, to bring about redemption, not just for Israel, but for all of humanity. The laws, the commandments, the sacrifices all were part of a divine tapestry that reached beyond time and place. Through Israel, the Creator would reveal his heart to the world, and through Israel, the world would be given the chance to know him. With the final reaffirmation of God's plan, Moses turned to the people, his gaze fixed on each face before him. "Choose life," he urged, "and live in the promise that has been given. This covenant is not only for the present, but for generations to come. Remember, in all your ways, that the Lord is with you." As the words faded into the silence of the desert, the promise of the eternal covenant stood firm, forever sealed in the hearts of Israel and in the heart of time itself.